Imagine standing in the freezing darkness of the ancient world. No cities, no medicine, no maps, no safety. One wrong decision could mean starvation, exile, or death. And yet humanity survived ice ages, collapsing climates, rising seas, deadly migrations, and disasters powerful enough to erase entire civilizations. But our ancestors did not survive because they were the strongest. They survived because someone remembered. The elders remembered where the water was hidden, which plants healed sickness, when the rivers would flood, and how to survive winters that nearly destroyed humanity before. Tonight, we explore the forgotten wisdom that carried our species through the most dangerous ages in history. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of ancient history and mystery you enjoy, the fire burns low against the wind, almost disappearing each time the cold surges down from the dark hills beyond the camp. Snow drifts across the entrance of the shelter in thin, restless ribbons. Somewhere far out on the frozen plain, animals move through the night in slow, invisible herds, their breath turning white beneath a sky crowded with unfamiliar stars. The youngest members of the group sleep close together beneath hides stiffened by frost. Hunters sit in silence, repairing cracked spear shafts with careful hands. Nobody wastes movement here. Nobody wastes heat. And near the center of the firelight sits the oldest woman in the camp. Her hair has long since turned pale with ashen age. One of her knees no longer bends properly. The skin on her hands carries the marks of decades spent scraping hides, cutting roots, preparing meat, weaving cord, lifting children, burying the dead. She cannot run with the hunters anymore. She cannot carry heavy loads across frozen valleys. Yet when the wind changes direction, every face still turns toward her first. Because she remembers where the river breaks through the ice first in early spring. She remembers which caves flood after heavy meltwater. She remembers the valley where game once disappeared for 3 straight winters. She remembers the taste of a bitter plant that kills slowly, and another that can stop fever when crushed into broth. She remembers where her people walked during the great cold years before the younger hunters were born. And in a world without maps, books, roads, medicine, governments, or permanent safety, memory may be the most valuable tool humanity possesses. Long before cities rise from riverbanks, before temples, before kings, before writing presses symbols into wet clay, human survival depends on knowledge carried inside living minds, not abstract knowledge, not philosophy, immediate knowledge, dangerous knowledge, the kind that decides whether a group freezes, starves, drinks poisoned water, walks into enemy territory, or survives another season. Modern people often imagine prehistoric life as a world dominated entirely by physical strength. Survival appears, at first glance, to belong to the fastest hunter, the strongest fighter, the youngest body. But what survives in the archaeological record suggests something more complicated, again and again. Evidence points toward the importance of older individuals within early human communities. Some skeletons reveal elderly people who lived for years despite severe injuries or disability, meaning others continued feeding and protecting them long after they could no longer contribute through raw physical labor alone. That decision carries enormous consequences. Keeping older people alive is expensive in harsh environments. Food is limited. Movement is exhausting. Winter punishes weakness without mercy. A group that supports elderly members must receive something critical in return. And increasingly, anthropologists believe the return may have been knowledge accumulated across decades of survival. The ancient world is unstable in ways difficult to fully imagine today. Entire coastlines disappear beneath rising seas. Grasslands become deserts within generations. Rivers shift course. Animal migrations fail. Storm patterns change. Volcanic eruptions darken skies thousands of kilometers away. In some regions, temperatures swing violently across centuries, reshaping forests and killing species that humans once depended upon. There are no forecasts, no written archives, no external systems waiting to help. Only memory. Some researchers call this deep survival knowledge. Information gathered not through single experiences, but through repeated exposure across many years. Which berries appear safe but become poisonous after frost? Which clouds signal deadly weather? Which animal trails remain reliable during drought? Which strangers can be trusted? Which routes lead to water after rivers dry? Younger hunters may have stronger bodies, but older survivors carry patterns invisible to those who have not yet lived long enough to see them repeat. Among certain indigenous cultures documented in more recent centuries, elders preserve astonishingly detailed ecological understanding. Oral traditions sometimes encode information about tides, fish behavior, seasonal burning practices, medicinal plants, navigation routes, and rare environmental dangers. Some stories once dismissed by outsiders as purely symbolic later prove linked to real geological or climatic events. In parts of Australia, oral histories may preserve memories of coastlines flooded thousands of years ago after the last Ice Age sea level rise. Scholars still debate exactly how accurately such memories survive across immense stretches of time, but the possibility alone changes how human history begins to look. Because civilization may not begin with stone walls or agriculture. It may begin beside fires like this one. The Ice Age world of early humans is not empty wilderness. It is crowded with threats. Cave lions move through forests. Packs of hyenas shadow camps at night. Mammoths cross open plains in enormous numbers. Rivers freeze hard enough to crack bone beneath the weight of travelers. In some regions, other human species still exist. Neanderthals survive across parts of Eurasia for thousands of years, while modern humans expand into unfamiliar territory. The evidence remains incomplete. But the overlap between these populations lasts long enough for exchanges of tools, genes, and perhaps even survival strategies. In such a world, experience matters enormously. A younger hunter may know how to kill an animal, an elder may know when not to try. That distinction can save entire groups. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have often noticed that older individuals contribute heavily through teaching, conflict mediation, childcare, food processing, and strategic decision-making. Grandmothers in particular appear to play a major role in some societies, helping sustain children while younger adults gather resources. One influential theory, known as the grandmother hypothesis, even suggests that human longevity itself may partly evolve because older individuals improve the survival chances of later generations. The idea remains debated. No single explanation fully accounts for the unusually long lifespan of humans compared to many other species. Yet one fact stands out clearly. Humans invest extraordinary effort in transferring knowledge across generations. Children are not simply raised. They are trained for survival over many years. A child must learn tracks, weather, language, edible plants, dangerous insects, animal behavior, tool-making, social rules, migration patterns, and hundreds of other details specific to their environment. Much of this knowledge cannot be discovered quickly through trial and error because error often means death. Eat the wrong route once and there is no second lesson. Walk across thinning river ice once and the current takes you beneath. Misread the sky before a storm and the cold finishes the rest. So human communities build memory systems long before writing exists. Stories become storage devices. Rituals preserve seasonal timing. Songs encode navigation routes. Repeated myths carry warnings hidden beneath symbolic language. Elders become living archives whose minds contain information gathered across decades of observation. And unlike written records, living memory adapts. An elder can answer questions, clarify danger, compare present conditions to older disasters, recognize patterns younger people cannot yet see. In many ways, ancient survival depends less on innovation than on continuity. Groups survive because somebody remembers what happened before. Sometimes that memory stretches back farther than anyone expects. Archaeologists working in Ice Age caves occasionally uncover evidence of astonishing continuity in human behavior. Certain hunting grounds remain in use for generations. Specific tool-making traditions pass carefully from one group to another. Burial practices repeat across centuries with remarkable consistency. Such patterns suggest cultures already possess strong methods for preserving knowledge even tens of thousands of years ago. But memory is fragile too. A single epidemic, drought, massacre, or migration can erase entire systems of accumulated understanding. If enough elders die at once, knowledge disappears with them. The location of waterholes, the meaning of stars, the cure for infections, the safe crossing through mountains. Once lost, some of that information may take generations to recover, if it is recovered at all. The ancient world is filled with these invisible extinctions. Not only species vanish, wisdom vanishes too. And perhaps nowhere is this more important than during moments of environmental crisis, when remembered survival strategies become the thin line separating endurance from catastrophe. Because as the climate shifts violently near the end of the Ice Age, humanity enters one of the most uncertain periods in its entire existence. Entire landscapes transform, seas rise, giant animals disappear, migration routes collapse, forests spread into former grasslands while deserts emerge elsewhere. And through all of it, small groups of humans continue moving forward across an unstable planet, carrying almost everything they know inside stories, rituals, scars, and aging human minds illuminated by firelight against the cold. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the farther back humanity travels into its own past, the clearer one unsettling truth becomes. Our species survives not simply because humans are strong. It survives because humans remember. The old man walks slowly across the sand, stopping now and then to touch stones that appear meaningless to everyone except the people following behind him. To an outsider, the landscape looks empty. Wind moves across dry earth beneath a white burning sky. There are no signs, no roads, no markers separating one stretch of desert from another. Yet the elder moves with absolute certainty. He knows where underground water gathers after distant rains. He knows which ridges become dangerous during seasonal storms. He knows the invisible boundaries between neighboring groups. More remarkably still, he carries songs that describe the entire route in precise sequence, each verse tied to landmarks, stars, distances, and sacred events connected to the land itself. The song is not entertainment. It is infrastructure. Long before libraries exist, human societies develop methods for storing enormous quantities of practical information without writing anything down. These systems are so effective that some oral traditions survive across hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of years. Modern people living inside worlds saturated with written language often underestimate how sophisticated memory can become when an entire culture depends upon it. But in ancient societies, memory is not casual, it is trained, structured, protected, and repeated constantly from childhood onward. Knowledge survives because forgetting is dangerous. In literate civilizations, information can sit dormant inside books for centuries. A document survives even after its author dies. But oral societies operate differently. Knowledge remains alive only through continuous human performance. Stories must be spoken. Songs must be sung. Rituals must be repeated. Elders must teach younger generations carefully enough that meaning survives intact across time. This creates a very different relationship with memory. Anthropologists studying oral cultures often note how repetition becomes central to social life. Narratives are recited during ceremonies, migrations, meals, seasonal gatherings, funerals, initiations, and religious events. Rhythm, symbolism, melody, and visual imagery help anchor information deeply within the mind. A story about a giant serpent carving rivers through the landscape may simultaneously encode navigation routes, water sources, territorial boundaries, and warnings about seasonal flooding. To modern ears, myth and practical survival often sound separate. In the ancient world, they are usually intertwined. Some of the oldest surviving human traditions may contain fragments of environmental memory carried across astonishing spans of time. Along the coasts of Australia, several indigenous oral histories describe shorelines that once existed farther out to sea before waters rose and drowned them. Geological evidence confirms that sea levels rise dramatically after the last ice age, flooding enormous areas of continental shelf between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. Scholars still debate how directly current stories connect to those ancient events, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the overlap is difficult to dismiss entirely. If even part of these traditions preserve genuine memories of prehistoric coastlines, then oral transmission has carried environmental knowledge farther through time than many civilizations preserve written records, and Australia is not unique. Across the Pacific Northwest of North America, indigenous stories describe earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and sudden landscape changes later supported by geological evidence. In Iceland, medieval oral traditions preserve details of eruptions and environmental disasters long before modern volcanology exists. Polynesian navigators memorize vast systems of ocean swells, stars, bird behavior, currents, cloud patterns, and seasonal winds capable of guiding canoes across thousands of kilometers of open sea. None of this knowledge exists casually. It requires specialists. In many ancient societies, elders become guardians not only of history but of precision. Mistakes inside oral traditions can carry deadly consequences. A corrupted migration route means starvation. An inaccurate seasonal ritual may disrupt planting cycles. A forgotten medicinal preparation may turn useful plants into poison. As a result, many cultures create elaborate systems to preserve accuracy. Apprentices repeat stories word for word. Ceremonial restrictions govern who may speak certain knowledge. Some traditions divide information by age, gender, family line, or social role to reduce distortion. Memory becomes social architecture. Even in societies that later develop writing, oral tradition often remains dominant for centuries. Ancient epics such as the works eventually associated with Homer likely circulate orally long before being written down. Early Vedic traditions in India preserve sacred texts through extraordinarily precise spoken repetition. Some scholars believe certain recitation methods become so exact that oral transmission occasionally proves more stable than early manuscript copying. Yet oral memory does something writing cannot fully replicate. It embeds knowledge emotionally inside living communities. A written warning about drought may sit unread for generations. A story connected to ancestors, sacred places, fear, pride, survival, and identity becomes much harder to ignore. Ancient memory systems succeed not only because they store information, but because they make people care enough to remember it. This emotional dimension may explain why catastrophe stories appear so widely across human cultures. Flood myths emerge on nearly every continent. Stories describe great fires falling from the sky, darkness covering the world, oceans swallowing land, winters that lasted too long, rivers drying unexpectedly, or entire peoples wandering after disaster. Of course, similarities between myths do not prove all such events literally occurred exactly as described. Human imagination naturally gravitates toward dramatic themes. Floods and storms are universal experiences. Some stories evolve symbolically over time. Others become reshaped by religion or political authority. Still, archaeologists and climate scientists increasingly recognize that ancient humans lived through genuine environmental upheavals capable of leaving lasting cultural scars. Near the end of the last ice age, rising seas flood millions of square kilometers of habitable land worldwide. Massive glacial lakes burst catastrophically. Sudden cooling events disrupt ecosystems across continents. Volcanic eruptions darken skies and damage harvests. In some regions, entire ways of life become unsustainable within relatively short periods. Human communities do not experience these changes as abstract climate data. They experience them as terror. The river no longer behaves correctly. Animals vanish from familiar valleys. Forests consume old hunting grounds. Saltwater poisons freshwater marshes. Coastlines disappear beneath waves. Ancient camps become inaccessible. Migration routes fail. Parents watch children starve. Survivors flee carrying whatever knowledge remains useful. And somewhere inside those migrations, stories begin forming. Stories about the sea that rose. Stories about the winter that never ended. Stories about the fire mountain. Stories about the ancestors who survived. Over generations, memory transforms, exact details blur, symbolism deepens, supernatural elements appear, yet beneath mythic language, fragments of lived experience may persist far longer than outsiders once believed possible. Modern archaeology increasingly treats oral tradition with greater caution and respect than earlier generations often did. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, many Western scholars dismissed indigenous narratives as unreliable folklore unless supported independently by written evidence. Today, researchers are more willing to consider that oral traditions may preserve valuable historical, ecological, and geographical information even when wrapped inside symbolic storytelling. No single explanation fully accounts for the durability of these traditions. Human memory is imperfect. Stories change over time. Political pressures reshape narratives. Colonization destroys countless knowledge systems before they can even be studied properly. Yet despite all these limitations, oral cultures repeatedly demonstrate astonishing informational resilience. Perhaps because ancient humans understand something modern societies sometimes forget. Knowledge is not only data, it is relationship. An elder teaching a child beside a fire transmits more than facts. The child learns tone, emphasis, emotion, caution, trust, identity, and belonging simultaneously. The landscape itself becomes part of memory. A cliff is not merely a geological formation. It is where ancestors sheltered during famine. A river bend is where someone drowned generations ago. A grove of trees marks safe passage during storms. Information attaches itself to human feeling and physical place, making it easier to preserve across time. This relationship between memory and landscape becomes especially important in dangerous environments, where survival depends upon reading subtle patterns invisible to strangers. In Arctic regions, indigenous hunters develop highly specialized vocabularies for snow, ice conditions, animal movement, and weather variation. Desert peoples recognize faint environmental signals outsiders overlook entirely. Forest communities identify medicinal plants among thousands of species with extraordinary precision. Such knowledge cannot be downloaded quickly. It requires immersion across years, and that means elders become indispensable, not because they know everything, but because they have seen enough seasons to recognize repetition. They remember which dangers return. They remember which solutions once worked. They carry comparison itself inside their minds. The ancient world changes constantly, but patterns survive beneath the chaos. And the people most capable of seeing those patterns are often the ones who have lived long enough to watch history repeat itself beneath different skies. The hunter kneels beside the carcass with blood freezing across his hands, while the others gather silently around him. Snow continues falling through the trees in soft, relentless waves. The animal is large enough to feed the group for days, but already the oldest man among them is studying something else entirely. Not the meat, not the hide, the sky. The clouds are wrong. The wind has shifted north far too quickly, carrying a brittle edge that does not belong to this season. The younger hunters are still flushed with triumph, focused on dividing the kill before scavengers arrive. But the elder understands a pattern they do not yet recognize. Heavy snow will close the pass by morning. If the group remains here too long, they will become trapped between rising drifts and the frozen river below. So before the butchering is even finished, preparations begin to move. This kind of knowledge rarely leaves physical traces behind. Archaeologists can uncover tools, bones, hearths, and fragments of ancient shelters, but experience itself fossilizes poorly. The judgment that saves a group from walking into a blizzard disappears almost completely once the people themselves are gone. Yet scattered evidence across anthropology, evolutionary biology, and prehistoric archaeology increasingly suggests that older humans played far more complex roles in survival than simple stereotypes about weakness and dependency once assumed. In dangerous environments, experience functions almost like another sensory system. The ancient world punishes delayed understanding harshly. A younger person may notice danger only once it becomes immediate. Someone who has already survived dozens of winters recognizes warning signs much earlier. A slight shift in bird migrations, a strange silence among insects, the color of clouds before rapid temperature collapse, the smell of distant fire carried on dry wind. Tiny irregularities accumulate into prediction, and prediction keeps people alive. Among modern hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, older individuals often contribute disproportionately through decision-making rather than raw physical labor. Experienced trackers identify animal behavior, younger hunters miss entirely. Elder women possess extensive botanical knowledge involving edible roots, medicinal plants, and seasonal gathering cycles. Senior members mediate disputes before violence fractures small communities that cannot afford internal division. This matters enormously because prehistoric human groups are fragile systems. A single injury can become fatal without treatment. A broken relationship between families can split communities apart. One failed migration may mean starvation. Humans survive not because they eliminate risk, but because they reduce uncertainty wherever possible. Elders help accomplish that by carrying mental maps built from accumulated observation. Some researchers argue that this may help explain one of the strangest features of human evolution itself. Humans live unusually long lives compared to many other mammals, especially considering how physically expensive large brains already are. Women frequently survive decades beyond childbearing years, something relatively rare in the animal kingdom. From a strictly reproductive perspective, this appears inefficient at first glance. Yet the grandmother hypothesis proposes that older individuals increase survival odds for grandchildren and broader kin groups by contributing food, childcare, and accumulated knowledge. The theory remains debated, and no single evolutionary explanation fully accounts for human longevity. Still, evidence increasingly suggests that older humans become biologically valuable, not despite their age, but because of it. Knowledge compounds over time. An elder healer, for example, may recognize symptoms impossible for younger people to interpret correctly. Ancient medicine is often imagined as primitive superstition, but this overlooks how much empirical observation early humans accumulate through repeated trial, error, and survival. Long before chemistry exists formally, people identify plants that reduce pain, limit infection, stimulate vomiting after poisoning, or calm inflammation. Some remedies fail completely. Others work for reasons ancient societies cannot yet understand scientifically. Willow bark, containing compounds related to aspirin, appears in traditional medicine across multiple cultures. Moldy substances with antibacterial properties occasionally appear in folk treatments. Fermented foods improve preservation and digestion. Smoke repels insects carrying disease. The people preserving this information are often older specialists who spend decades refining practical understanding. Without writing, however, expertise becomes dangerously vulnerable. If a healer dies unexpectedly before teaching successors properly, entire medical traditions may vanish. The same applies to navigation skills, hunting strategies, food preservation methods, spiritual ceremonies, and environmental knowledge. Ancient societies therefore develop strong cultural incentives to protect older individuals and encourage transmission between generations. What survives in the archaeological record hints at this protection repeatedly. At the site of Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq, researchers uncover Neanderthal skeletons showing signs of severe injury and disability. One individual survives for years despite blindness in one eye, significant hearing loss, and major arm damage. Another suffers crippling injuries yet lives long afterward. These individuals almost certainly require social support to survive. The discoveries challenge older portrayals of prehistoric humans as purely brutal creatures abandoning weak members immediately. Instead, evidence suggests something far more complicated. Compassion exists, cooperation exists, long-term care exists. And with care comes the possibility that injured or elderly individuals continue contributing through memory, teaching, and social authority even after physical strength declines. This may become especially important during periods of environmental instability, when survival depends less on routine and more on adaptation. During ordinary years, younger hunters can rely heavily on direct experience. During unusual years, only elders may remember comparable events from decades earlier. A drought that occurs once every 40 years cannot be understood fully by people who have only lived 20. An elder who remembers the last great famine carries priceless information. Where emergency water sources exist, Which foods remain edible when ordinary game disappears? Which neighbouring groups become hostile under stress? Which migration routes stay open longest? This creates an unusual social dynamic within prehistoric communities. Strength belongs largely to youth, but authority often gravitates toward experience, because experience reduces deadly uncertainty. The relationship is not always peaceful. Of course, generational conflict likely exists in every era of human history. Younger individuals push boundaries. Older members resist dangerous risks. Some traditions become outdated. Some elders misjudge changing conditions. Human memory is powerful but imperfect. People remember selectively. Trauma distorts recollection. Myth merges with observation. Environmental conditions shift beyond previous experience. Scholars still debate how accurately oral survival knowledge adapts across major climatic disruptions. Yet despite these limitations, accumulated experience remains one of humanity's greatest advantages over other predators. A lion inherits instincts. Humans inherit instructions. This difference allows people to survive in environments far outside normal biological limits: Arctic tundra, high mountains, dense rainforest, open ocean, deserts with almost no surface water. Humans occupy these regions not because their bodies evolve rapidly enough to adapt genetically, but because knowledge moves faster than evolution. Clothing techniques compensate for cold. Fire management alters ecosystems. Food preparation neutralizes toxins. Shelter design reduces exposure. Navigation methods allow seasonal migration. Each innovation depends upon teaching, and teaching depends upon memory. By the late Ice Age, humans are spreading into increasingly difficult landscapes across the globe. Some groups follow coastlines into new continents. Others move through frozen northern territories beside retreating glaciers. Sea crossings carry humans toward isolated islands where unfamiliar plants and animals await them. Every migration introduces fresh dangers. Yet over and over again, humans survive environments that should overwhelm relatively small bands of physically vulnerable primates. Part of the answer lies in collective intelligence stretched across generations. No single human knows enough alone. A child inherits survival from parents. Parents inherit it from grandparents. Grandparents inherit it from people already forgotten. Knowledge accumulates slowly like layers of sediment, forming invisible structures beneath every successful society. Most ancient humans never think of themselves as innovators changing history. They simply remember what worked before. Which is why the loss of elders during catastrophe can become so devastating. Disease, violence, starvation, or displacement does not merely reduce population numbers, it can erase accumulated experience gathered across lifetimes. A group may survive physically while losing critical ecological knowledge needed to remain stable in the long term. Anthropologists studying colonized indigenous societies later observed this pattern repeatedly. When epidemics kill older generations disproportionately, languages disappear, rituals vanish, medicinal expertise collapses, and entire systems of environmental understanding fragment within decades. The same danger likely exists throughout prehistory. Human survival depends not only on bodies enduring hardship, but on memories surviving long enough to guide the future. And sometimes the most valuable person in an ancient camp is not the strongest hunter carrying fresh meat through the snow. It is the aging survivor sitting quietly beside the fire, watching the sky, remembering what happened the last time the wind changed like this. The old woman's face is painted with ashen red ochre as the community gathers around the edge of the firelight. Children sit closest to her feet. Hunters stand farther back with lowered eyes. Nobody interrupts while she speaks. The story unfolding in the darkness is older than anyone listening. It tells of rivers changing course, of a winter when animals vanished from the valley, of ancestors forced to leave behind the bones of their dead and walk toward distant mountains under skies that never stopped snowing. Whether every detail is literally true no longer matters. The story has become law. Across the ancient world, societies separated by oceans, climates, and thousands of years repeatedly develop traditions that elevate older individuals into positions of unusual authority. Elders become judges, healers, spiritual intermediaries, historians, negotiators, astronomers, and guardians of sacred knowledge. Some communities treat age itself as evidence of wisdom. Others view long life almost as proof of supernatural protection. To survive many decades in harsh prehistoric conditions appears extraordinary enough that longevity acquires symbolic power beyond simple biology. Old age becomes sacred because survival is sacred. In modern industrial societies, aging often carries associations with decline, retirement, and social invisibility. But in small, ancient communities where survival remains uncertain, someone who has endured 40, 50, or 60 years possesses something rare, accumulated proof of competence. They have survived disease outbreaks, dangerous winters, childbirth, conflict, famine, migration, and environmental shifts that killed many others. Every scar becomes testimony. Archaeological evidence increasingly reveals that prehistoric populations contain fewer elderly individuals than most modern societies. High infant mortality, injuries, infections, and environmental hazards make reaching advanced age difficult. Exact life expectancy calculations for ancient populations are complicated and sometimes misunderstood. Average lifespans appear low partly because so many children die young, yet even accounting for this, genuinely old individuals remain relatively uncommon in many prehistoric settings, which means age itself becomes visible. An elder carries memories stretching farther into the past than anyone else alive. They may remember landscapes before floods altered them. They may recall alliances formed before younger adults were born. They may know rituals no longer practiced regularly. In oral cultures especially, this creates tremendous social value because knowledge literally disappears when knowledgeable individuals die. Some anthropologists describe elders in oral societies as time anchors. They stabilize continuity between generations. Without them, communities risk losing not only practical survival skills but identity itself. Stories about ancestors, migration origins, sacred places, territorial boundaries, and social obligations all depend upon careful transmission across time. And transmission requires trust. Age helps create that trust because survival implies experience. A younger person may possess talent, strength, or charisma, but elders possess endurance. They have already lived through enough disasters to command attention when danger approaches. In unstable environments, this matters deeply. Among many indigenous societies documented historically, councils of older individuals guide major decisions involving migration, conflict resolution, seasonal timing, or spiritual ceremony. Exact structures vary enormously across cultures, and no single model fits every society. Some communities remain highly egalitarian. Others develop hereditary authority or rigid hierarchies. Yet again and again, older members occupy influential positions linked directly to accumulated memory. Sometimes this authority becomes deeply spiritual. In parts of ancient Africa, Australia, Siberia, and the Americas, elders serve as custodians of sacred narratives explaining how landscapes, animals, weather, and humanity itself are connected. These traditions often contain detailed ecological information embedded inside ceremonial systems. Knowledge may only be revealed gradually across stages of life, meaning elders possess layers of understanding inaccessible to younger members. This restriction is not simply about power, it also protects accuracy. Dangerous knowledge cannot circulate carelessly in fragile societies. Misusing hunting grounds, disturbing sacred water sources, violating seasonal restrictions, or performing ceremonies incorrectly may threaten social stability or environmental balance. Some oral traditions therefore survive through tightly controlled systems, where elders regulate who learns specific information and when. Memory becomes both sacred and strategic. Even death itself acquires different meaning in such cultures. The passing of an elder is not merely personal grief. It can represent the destruction of an irreplaceable archive. Anthropologists working with indigenous communities have sometimes described older individuals carrying unique knowledge of songs, medicinal practices, languages, or ceremonial traditions known nowhere else. Once lost, entire intellectual worlds vanish permanently. The ancient world experiences these disappearances constantly. Most human knowledge leaves no durable physical trace behind. Stone tools survive for thousands of years. Spoken wisdom usually does not. Archaeologists excavate fragments of buildings and bones, while enormous systems of memory disappear almost invisibly from history. Yet hints remain. Some prehistoric burials suggest elderly individuals receive unusual care or symbolic treatment. At sites across Eurasia and the Americas, older bodies are buried with ornaments, tools, pigments, or ceremonial positioning that imply social importance. Scholars remain cautious about overinterpreting such evidence. Burial customs vary widely, and no single explanation fully accounts for every pattern. But certain trends appear repeatedly enough to suggest that many ancient societies value older members beyond purely economic usefulness. One especially striking example emerges from Upper Paleolithic Europe, where archaeologists uncover graves containing individuals with significant physical disabilities who survive long past the point when independent survival seems likely. These discoveries imply social systems capable of sustained caregiving and perhaps respect attached to individuals who endure hardship across long lives. Survival alone may generate authority. There is also another reason elders become spiritually significant. They embody memory of the dead. In oral societies, ancestors remain socially present through continuous storytelling and ritual repetition. Elders often serve as the last living connection to people already gone. A grandparent may personally remember ancestors known to younger generations only through stories. This creates a kind of living bridge across time. The elder becomes proof that the past truly happened. And in uncertain worlds, continuity itself offers psychological stability. The ancient environment changes constantly. Floods destroy settlements, drought empties valleys, animal populations collapse, warfare scatters communities. Against such instability, elders preserve the reassuring idea that humanity has survived catastrophe before. This may partly explain why so many ancient traditions associate wisdom with age even when younger individuals hold greater physical power. The elder represents accumulated adaptation. They are evidence that survival is possible. Of course, reverence for elders is never universal or perfect. Ancient societies are human societies, filled with conflict, inequality, and contradiction. Some older individuals undoubtedly lose status when they can no longer contribute meaningfully. Harsh environments sometimes force impossible choices during famine or migration. Historical and ethnographic records include painful examples of abandonment, neglect, or ritualized death among certain groups under extreme conditions. The evidence remains complex. Still, the broader pattern stands out clearly. Across continents and centuries, humans repeatedly organize survival around intergenerational memory. Older individuals become valuable because experience allows communities to compress time. Instead of relearning every danger from scratch, younger generations inherit accumulated understanding built through countless earlier failures. This inheritance shapes civilization itself. Long before written law codes or formal schools appear, humanity already possesses teachers, already possesses historians, already possesses specialists in ecology, medicine, diplomacy, astronomy, and ritual continuity. Most of them are old. And perhaps most importantly, elders preserve the one thing ancient humans cannot afford to lose: perspective. A drought feels permanent to someone who has never seen rain return. An elder remembers otherwise. A failed harvest feels like the end of the world to frightened children. An elder remembers harder winters survived before. A political conflict feels unprecedented to younger warriors eager for violence. An elder remembers how quickly revenge destroys small communities. Age does not guarantee wisdom. Human history proves that repeatedly. Some traditions become destructive. Some leaders cling to outdated beliefs while conditions change around them. But in the ancient world, where uncertainty dominates nearly every aspect of existence, long memory remains one of humanity's strongest defenses against panic and collapse. Because when storms arrive, the people most capable of guiding others through darkness are often the ones who have already walked through it before. Long before historians begin writing chronicles, long before priests carve records into stone, humanity is already telling stories about worlds that ended. A wall of water swallowing the land, fire falling from the sky, a winter so cruel that animals disappear and forests die, darkness covering the sun, entire peoples wandering across empty landscapes after some forgotten catastrophe destroys the old order of things. These stories emerge again and again across civilizations separated by oceans and centuries. Ancient Mesopotamians describe a great flood sent to erase humanity. Greek traditions speak of successive ages destroyed by divine punishment and disaster. Norse mythology imagines a final winter before the collapse of the world itself. Indigenous traditions across the Americas preserve memories of fire, earthquakes, giant waves, and migrations triggered by environmental upheaval in South Asia, East Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Arctic. Similar themes continue appearing with striking persistence. For centuries, scholars often dismiss such stories as pure invention or religious symbolism. But the deeper archaeologists, geologists, and climate scientists investigate the ancient past, the harder it becomes to ignore a difficult possibility. Some myths may contain distorted memories of real catastrophes experienced by human communities long ago. Not exact historical records, not literal transcripts, but fragments. Echoes. The ancient world is far more violent and unstable than many modern people realize. Human beings evolved during the chaotic climate swings of the Pleistocene, a period shaped by advancing glaciers, abrupt warming events, volcanic eruptions, megafaunal extinctions, and constantly shifting ecosystems. Entire coastlines later vanish beneath rising seas after the Ice Age ends. Vast grasslands become forests. Lakes disappear. Deserts emerge where rivers once flowed. Human societies do not observe these changes from a distance. They live inside them. And because early communities possess no written archives, Survival knowledge moves through narrative instead. Stories become containers capable of preserving warnings across generations long after direct witnesses die. Some myths may even preserve practical instructions disguised as sacred tradition. Along the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, several indigenous oral traditions describe enormous earthquakes followed by giant waves consuming coastal settlements. For years, outsiders treated these accounts primarily as spiritual narratives. Then geological evidence confirmed that a massive earthquake along the Cascadia subduction zone strikes the region around the year 1700, producing a tsunami recorded as far away as Japan. The stories remember. Elsewhere, Aboriginal Australian traditions describe landscapes that once existed before rising seas flooded them thousands of years ago. In parts of the Mediterranean, myths associated with flooding, collapsing islands, and fire from mountains may preserve distant cultural memories linked to volcanic eruptions or coastal disasters. Scholars still debate how directly such stories connect to real events, and no single explanation fully accounts for all parallels. Human imagination naturally gravitates toward catastrophe because catastrophe shapes emotional memory powerfully. Yet it is precisely that emotional intensity which may help ancient knowledge survive. Traumatic experiences embed themselves deeply inside communities. A devastating flood does not become merely weather, it becomes identity. Parents repeat the story so children understand where not to build, when to flee, whom to trust, and what signs precede danger. Over generations, supernatural elements grow around the memory. Gods appear, monsters emerge, moral lessons become attached. But beneath symbolism, traces of environmental reality may persist astonishingly long. Modern neuroscience offers clues about why. Humans remember emotionally charged narratives far more effectively than abstract information. A dry warning about coastal flooding is easy to forget. A sacred story about ancestral punishment delivered through rising seas becomes unforgettable. Oral cultures often preserve information successfully not despite mythology, but because mythology makes memory durable. Ancient people may therefore encode practical survival knowledge inside narratives specifically, because stories travel farther through time than ordinary instructions. One of the clearest examples involves fire management. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples in Australia, North America, and elsewhere use controlled burning to shape ecosystems deliberately. These practices reduce catastrophic wildfire risk, encourage edible plant growth, improve hunting conditions, and maintain biodiversity. European colonizers often misunderstand or suppress these traditions, assuming untamed wilderness is natural. In many regions, the suppression of indigenous burning practices later contributes to far larger and more destructive wildfires. The knowledge survives originally through oral teaching, ritual timing, and elder instruction rather than written manuals. And this pattern appears repeatedly throughout human history. Knowledge attached to story survives longer. Knowledge detached from meaning often disappears. The same may apply to navigation traditions among Polynesian sailors. Long before European ships enter the Pacific, expert navigators cross enormous ocean distances using stars, swells, bird movements, wind patterns, and cloud formations. Much of this information passes orally through chants, apprenticeship, and ceremonial instruction. Some techniques become so specialized that only a few master navigators preserve them fully. When those lineages break, knowledge vanishes rapidly. The fragility of oral memory creates constant tension inside ancient societies. Stories preserve survival, but only if communities continue repeating them accurately. Every generation risks forgetting details, altering meanings, or losing elders before instruction is complete. This vulnerability becomes especially dangerous during periods of collapse. Archaeology repeatedly reveals civilizations experiencing sudden fragmentation after droughts, invasions, epidemics, crop failures, or political instability. The Late Bronze Age collapse around the eastern Mediterranean destroys major palace systems and trade networks. Classic Maya cities decline amid environmental stress and warfare. Norse Greenland settlements disappear during worsening climate conditions and economic isolation. Across these crises, physical destruction is only part of the story. Knowledge systems collapse too. Trade routes disappear. Agricultural expertise fragments. Languages vanish. Ritual continuity breaks. And when memory networks fail, societies often become less resilient precisely when resilience matters most. This may explain why ancient cultures place such enormous emphasis on preserving myths, ceremonies, and ancestral traditions, even when modern observers sometimes see them as irrational or purely symbolic. Embedded inside these systems may be practical lessons accumulated through centuries of survival. Do not settle too close to the river. Store food before winter deepens. Respect seasonal limits on hunting. Leave the coast when the sea behaves strangely. Do not ignore the mountain when smoke rises. Sometimes the warning survives only as sacred taboo after the original reason is forgotten. Anthropologists studying oral traditions occasionally encounter customs that appear strange until environmental context becomes clear. Certain fishing restrictions preserve breeding populations. Ritual travel patterns avoid dangerous seasonal conditions. Sacred groves protect water sources or medicinal plants. Cultural memory operates even when communities no longer consciously explain every detail scientifically. Of course, myths can also mislead. Stories evolve politically. Religious authorities reshape narratives. Communities invent traditions to justify power structures or territorial claims. Some catastrophe myths likely reflect symbolic fears more than literal events. Fringe theorists often exaggerate connections between myths and lost civilizations without sufficient evidence. No ancient flood story proves the existence of a single global catastrophe wiping out advanced forgotten empires. The evidence does not support such claims, but rejecting exaggerated theories does not diminish the remarkable possibility that oral traditions genuinely preserve ancient environmental memory in meaningful ways. Human beings are storytelling animals because stories help us survive. A list of instructions may fail under stress. A sacred narrative remembered since childhood remains. And nowhere is this more visible than in moments when entire societies stand at the edge of disaster, relying on remembered warnings passed down from people who survived earlier catastrophes generations before. The elder beside the fire may not understand plate tectonics, atmospheric cycles, or glacial meltwater pulses in scientific terms, but she remembers what the ancestors said happened the last time the sea withdrew too far from shore. She remembers which valleys flood first after strange winters. She remembers the old story about smoke rising from the mountain before darkness covered the sky. And in the ancient world, where written certainty does not yet exist, remembered stories often become humanity's first disaster manuals. The coastline stretches endlessly beneath a grey sky while waves crash against black volcanic rock. Small groups move carefully along the shore carrying children, woven baskets, stone blades, bundles of dried food, and smouldering embers protected inside shells or bark containers. Behind them lie lands growing colder and less predictable with each passing generation. Ahead lies territory nobody in the group has ever seen before. And still they keep moving. Human migration is often imagined as a story of fearless explorers driven by curiosity or ambition. But much of ancient migration begins in pressure and uncertainty. Rivers dry, herds disappear, glaciers advance, sea levels rise, volcanic eruptions poison landscapes, populations grow too large for local resources, conflict spreads between neighboring groups, entire communities face a simple choice repeated throughout prehistory: adapt or leave. Yet leaving is unimaginably dangerous when the world beyond familiar territory remains almost completely unknown. Without maps, roads, compasses, or written guides, migration depends heavily upon memory carried between generations. Elders become essential not because they know the future, but because they remember fragments of the past that help communities navigate uncertainty. Stories about distant valleys, seasonal water sources, dangerous coastlines, or earlier journeys may survive long after direct witnesses are gone, and sometimes those memories guide humanity into entirely new worlds. Archaeologists still debate the precise routes and timing of many ancient migrations, but the broad outline is clear. Over tens of thousands of years, humans spread outward from Africa into deserts, forests, frozen tundra, mountain ranges, islands, and eventually nearly every habitable region on Earth. This expansion happens gradually through countless small decisions rather than single, heroic expeditions. Families move a little farther each generation. Hunters follow migrating animals beyond known territory. Coastal travelers continue around unfamiliar shorelines. Displaced groups seek refuge after environmental collapse. Most migrations probably feel less like exploration and more like survival. What makes this expansion extraordinary is not simply distance. It is adaptability. Humans repeatedly enter environments that should overwhelm a species evolved originally for warmer African climates. Arctic cold alone poses enormous challenges. Without fire, tailored clothing, shelters, social cooperation, and detailed ecological knowledge, survival becomes almost impossible. Experience, therefore, matters enormously during movement into unfamiliar territory. A younger hunter may possess strength and speed, but older individuals remember patterns that reduce catastrophic mistakes. Which stars remain reliable for navigation? How weather shifts near mountains? Which coastlines become impassable during storms? How to ration food during long journeys? Which neighbouring groups trade peacefully and which attack strangers? Many ancient migrations likely succeed because communities combine youthful mobility with elder memory. The peopling of Australia offers one remarkable example. Humans reached the continent at least 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier, meaning they crossed stretches of open water long before formal ships or written navigation systems exist. Scholars still debate exactly how these voyages occur. The evidence remains incomplete, yet intentional crossings almost certainly happen. People transport families, tools, and survival knowledge across dangerous marine environments into ecosystems unlike any they previously encountered. Such journeys require planning. Planning requires communication, and communication depends upon preserved knowledge. The same pattern appears later across the Pacific, where Polynesian navigators accomplish some of the most astonishing ocean migrations in human history. Using stars, currents, bird behavior, wave patterns, and cloud formations, they settle islands scattered across millions of square kilometers of ocean. European observers initially struggled to believe such navigation is possible without instruments. Yet oral traditions, apprenticeship systems, and elder instruction preserve highly specialized knowledge, capable of guiding voyages across seemingly empty seas. Navigation becomes memory externalized into culture. In many traditional Pacific societies, master navigators memorize complex mental maps linking stars, islands, swells, and seasonal conditions together into living systems of orientation. Some knowledge remains secret or restricted to initiated specialists. Songs, chants, and ritual instruction help encode information difficult to preserve through casual conversation alone. Again, the survival of entire communities depends upon continuity between generations. If experienced navigators die without teaching successors, roots disappear. This vulnerability likely shapes countless migrations throughout human history. Consider the first humans entering the Americas near the end of the Ice Age. Whether groups travel primarily through interior corridors, along Pacific coastlines, or through combinations of routes remains debated among researchers. New discoveries continue reshaping the picture. But regardless of exact pathways, these migrations occur during periods of enormous environmental instability. Glaciers dominate vast northern landscapes. Sea levels remain lower than today. Ecosystems shift rapidly as climates warm. People crossing such environments must carry detailed survival strategies with them. How to preserve food, how to make insulated clothing, how to hunt unfamiliar animals, how to recognize dangerous ice conditions, how to survive long winters with limited resources. No single individual invents all this knowledge alone during migration itself. Communities inherit it from earlier generations who survive comparable conditions elsewhere. And yet migration also transforms knowledge. Old survival systems do not always work in new landscapes. Plants differ. Seasons behave differently. Animal migrations follow unfamiliar rhythms. Coastal peoples moving inland face new ecological challenges. Forest hunters entering open grasslands must adapt quickly or perish. This creates one of the central tensions of ancient survival. Tradition preserves life, but rigid tradition can also become dangerous when environments change too dramatically. Elders therefore serve not only as guardians of memory but as interpreters of change. The most successful communities are likely those capable of balancing inherited wisdom with flexible adaptation. Oral traditions survive best when they evolve carefully alongside shifting realities rather than remaining frozen permanently. Anthropologists studying migration traditions often find stories emphasizing both continuity and transformation. Ancestors preserve sacred practices, but they also discover new lands, encounter unfamiliar peoples, and modify survival techniques under pressure. Human culture becomes cumulative precisely because each generation inherits knowledge and adjusts it slightly to current conditions. Over thousands of years, this process reshapes humanity completely. People learn to survive Arctic darkness using animal fat lamps and insulated shelters. Desert communities master water conservation and seasonal mobility. Highland populations adapt agriculture to thin mountain air. Coastal societies build fishing systems tied closely to tides and currents. Forest peoples identify medicinal plants among vast biodiversity invisible to outsiders. All of it depends upon teaching. And teaching becomes most important during movement, when mistakes multiply rapidly. Ancient migration is not smooth expansion across empty territory either. Humans encounter predators, rival groups, unfamiliar diseases, harsh climates, and logistical disasters. Some migrations fail entirely. Archaeology reveals abandoned settlements, isolated populations disappearing mysteriously, and collapsed colonies unable to adapt. Norse settlements in Greenland eventually vanish after centuries of struggle involving climate deterioration, economic isolation, and ecological pressure. The people there possess remarkable survival skills, yet still disappear from the historical record. Knowledge alone cannot eliminate danger, but lack of knowledge magnifies it catastrophically. This is why many migration stories preserved in oral traditions focus intensely on guidance from older figures. Ancestors, elders, navigators, shamans, and memory keepers repeatedly appear as central characters in journeys across dangerous terrain. Sometimes these figures are historical, sometimes symbolic. Often the distinction blurs over time. What matters is the recognition that survival depends upon remembered experience. Even today, traces of these ancient migration memories remain embedded inside cultural traditions worldwide. Indigenous songlines across Australia encode travel routes and environmental knowledge through narrative geography. Arctic communities preserve detailed seasonal understanding accumulated over countless generations. Polynesian voyaging traditions are being revived after periods of colonial suppression. In many cases, modern scientific research increasingly confirms the accuracy of ecological observations embedded inside oral systems once dismissed by outsiders. The farther researchers look into humanity's deep past, the clearer one pattern becomes. Humans do not conquer the world through strength alone. They carry maps inside stories. They transport ecosystems through memory. They survive impossible journeys because older generations remember enough about danger to guide younger people beyond the edge of familiar land. And somewhere along countless ancient coastlines, beside glaciers, deserts, forests, and storm-dark oceans, elders walk slowly at the center of migrating groups, carrying the most important cargo humanity has ever possessed: the accumulated memory of how to survive. The child's fever rises through the night while rain hammers against the roof of woven branches overhead. Smoke from the fire thickens inside the shelter, mixing with the smell of damp earth, animal fat, and crushed herbs. Outside, darkness presses against the camp in heavy silence. Inside, one elderly woman remains awake beside the child, grinding roots carefully between stones worn smooth by years of use. She has seen this illness before. Not once, many times. She recognizes the trembling hands, the heat behind the eyes, the breathing pattern that becomes dangerous near dawn. She knows which plants ease pain and which do nothing at all. She knows how to cool the body slowly rather than too quickly. She knows when recovery is likely and when death is already approaching despite every effort. No written text records her knowledge. No formal institution protects it. And yet for thousands of years, survival across the ancient world depends heavily upon people like her. Modern medicine often creates the illusion that healing begins only with laboratories, hospitals, and scientific instruments. But long before chemistry, microbiology, or anatomy become formal disciplines, humans are already studying the body through relentless observation. Ancient healers accumulate practical understanding through generations of trial, failure, memory, and adaptation. Some conclusions prove incorrect or symbolic rather than effective. Others work surprisingly well despite lacking scientific explanation. What survives in the archaeological and ethnographic record suggests that early medical knowledge is often extensive, cautious, and deeply connected to elder experience. This should not be surprising. Illness is one of humanity's oldest teachers. Every ancient community confronts infection, injury, childbirth complications, parasites, malnutrition, poisoning, and trauma constantly. A broken bone can become fatal through infection alone. Minor cuts kill after days of fever. Childbirth remains dangerous even under favourable conditions. In many environments, Survival depends upon recognizing subtle symptoms before they become irreversible. Experience matters enormously. A younger person may know that certain plants are useful. An elder healer knows when to harvest them, which parts are safe, how much becomes poisonous, and how they interact with other remedies. Such details cannot be discovered quickly. They emerge through decades of accumulated observation, often preserved orally across generations. Archaeologists occasionally uncover evidence hinting at surprisingly sophisticated ancient medical practices. Trepanation, the drilling or scraping of holes into the skull, appears in multiple prehistoric cultures worldwide. Some patients survive long enough for substantial healing to occur afterward, meaning the procedure is not always fatal. Scholars still debate the exact reasons for these operations. Some may relate to injury treatment, pressure relief, ritual practice, or spiritual belief. No single explanation fully accounts for all cases. Yet the survival rates alone suggest considerable practical skill in at least some communities. Ancient dentistry offers another remarkable example. At sites in South Asia dating back thousands of years, researchers discover drilled teeth that indicate deliberate dental treatment using surprisingly advanced techniques for the time. Herbal medicines appear across nearly every known ancient culture. Some remedies prove ineffective, others later align closely with modern pharmacological understanding. Willow bark reduces pain because it contains salicin compounds related to aspirin. Foxglove eventually contributes to heart medicine. Certain fermented substances inhibit bacterial growth. Honey helps protect wounds from infection. Ancient people do not understand bacteria or molecular chemistry scientifically, but repeated survival allows useful practices to persist. The challenge is preservation. In oral societies, medicine exists largely inside human memory. Recipes, diagnoses, ritual procedures, and ecological knowledge all depend upon transmission between generations. Elder healers therefore become living medical archives. Their authority comes not only from spirituality or social status, but from demonstrated experience with life and death itself. And death is everywhere in the ancient world. Infant mortality remains extraordinarily high across most prehistoric and early historic societies. Epidemics sweep through communities without warning. Parasites weaken populations chronically. Nutritional shortages damage immune systems. Violence leaves wounds vulnerable to infection. Environmental disasters create famine conditions that magnify disease spread dramatically. Under such conditions, even modest medical knowledge can transform survival odds. Anthropologists studying traditional healing systems often find combinations of practical treatment, psychological support, spiritual interpretation, and social cohesion operating simultaneously. Modern distinctions between medicine, religion, and ritual frequently do not exist in the same way within ancient cultures. A healing ceremony may involve herbal treatment, storytelling, emotional reassurance, group participation, and spiritual symbolism all at once. To outsiders, such systems can appear irrational. Yet modern research increasingly recognizes that healing is never purely mechanical. Belief, stress reduction, social care, and emotional stability affect recovery in measurable ways. Ancient healers may not understand physiology scientifically, but many understand human suffering intimately through lived experience. And perhaps most importantly, they understand patterns. An elder healer remembers which illnesses spread during wet seasons, which symptoms precede death, which foods help recovery after famine, which injuries usually heal and which rarely do. Over time, these observations accumulate into practical expertise difficult to replace quickly once lost. This fragility becomes especially dangerous during social collapse. When populations decline suddenly through war, epidemic, or environmental catastrophe, older generations often die disproportionately. Along with them disappear languages, ecological understanding, and medical systems refined over centuries. Historians examining colonial encounters repeatedly observe this pattern. Indigenous communities devastated by introduced diseases lose not only people, but irreplaceable intellectual traditions before outsiders fully understand what has vanished. The same invisible losses likely occur countless times throughout prehistory. A healer dies during migration. A famine wipes out older specialists. A conflict destroys ceremonial lineages. Knowledge disappears silently. Sometimes archaeology reveals only faint traces of what once existed. Grinding stones stained with medicinal residue. Carefully arranged burials suggesting ritual treatment of illness. Skeletons showing healed fractures that required prolonged care. Pollen remains indicating the use of plants not native to surrounding environments. Each clue hints at systems of healing now mostly erased from memory. One especially revealing detail appears repeatedly in prehistoric skeletons. People survive injuries that should have killed them alone. Broken legs heal. Severe wounds close over. Disabled individuals live years beyond traumatic accidents. This implies caregiving networks strong enough to sustain vulnerable members during long recovery periods. Someone gathers food for the injured, someone protects them, someone cleans wounds and changes bandages, someone remembers which treatments improve survival chances. Compassion becomes practical survival strategy. The ancient healer therefore occupies a unique position within human society. Part scientist, part memory keeper, part spiritual guide, part caretaker. Their authority grows not from abstract theory, but from accumulated encounters with suffering. Every epidemic teaches lessons. Every childbirth adds experience. Every survival and every death refines understanding slightly further. And because knowledge remains oral, age becomes deeply connected to medical authority. The healer who has treated illness for 40 years carries vastly more information than a novice. They have seen rare conditions return after decades. They recognize environmental triggers younger generations overlook. They remember what worked during earlier crises. This memory may become most valuable during catastrophic periods when ordinary systems fail completely. After volcanic eruptions darken skies and damage harvests, malnutrition spreads disease rapidly. During prolonged droughts, contaminated water increases infection. Migrations expose populations to unfamiliar parasites and illnesses. War creates crowded conditions where epidemics flourish. At such moments, experienced healers preserve fragments of stability inside collapsing worlds. Of course, ancient medicine has limits. Many treatments fail entirely. Countless people die from conditions now easily curable. Superstition sometimes worsens suffering. Harmful practices coexist beside useful ones. No romantic vision of traditional healing should ignore the brutal realities of ancient mortality. Still, what survives in the record suggests something remarkable. Human beings spend tens of thousands of years building medical knowledge collectively long before modern science formalizes it. And much of that knowledge survives because elders remember. The old woman beside the fire cannot explain viruses, immune systems, or cellular infection. She does not know the chemical structure of the roots she grinds into medicine. But she knows this fever. She knows how it behaves. She knows who survived last time. And in the ancient world, where uncertainty shadows every illness, that knowledge alone can mean the difference between another sunrise and another grave beside the edge of camp. The sky turns pale and strange above the valley long before anyone understands what is happening. At first the changes seem small. Summers arrive late. Herds fail to appear along their usual migration routes. Rivers shrink earlier each year. Then comes the hunger. Children wake through the night crying from empty stomachs. Hunters walk farther and return with less meat. Old alliances between neighbouring groups begin to fracture under pressure. Smoke rises from distant settlements abandoned in silence. And somewhere within the growing fear, the elders begin telling old stories again. Stories about another dry period long ago. Stories about hidden springs in the hills. Stories about plants once eaten during famine. Stories warning that panic destroys communities faster than hunger itself. The ancient world collapses more often than people once believed. For generations, historians tended to imagine civilization as a steady upward climb, from primitive beginnings toward increasing complexity and progress. Archaeology now paints a much harsher picture. Human societies repeatedly build systems that appear stable for centuries before drought, disease, warfare, volcanic eruptions, trade disruptions, ecological exhaustion, or climate shifts tear them apart with surprising speed. Cities empty, trade networks vanish, languages disappear, knowledge fragments. And during these moments of collapse, remembered survival strategies become priceless. Modern societies rely heavily on external systems infrastructure, written archives, centralized governments, industrial food distribution, medical institutions, digital communication. Ancient communities possess far fewer buffers against disruption. A failed harvest may trigger immediate famine. A broken trade route can collapse entire economies. Several years of unusual weather may permanently destabilize political authority. Under such conditions, oral memory often becomes the only surviving continuity. The Late Bronze Age collapse offers one striking example. Around the late 2nd millennium BCE, major powers across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East begin fragmenting rapidly. Palace systems fail, trade routes disintegrate, cities burn or are abandoned. Literacy declines sharply in some regions after administrative networks disappear. Scholars still debate the exact causes. Climate stress, invasions, internal rebellion, earthquakes, and economic fragility likely interact together in complex ways. No single explanation fully accounts for the scale of disruption. Yet one consequence appears clearly. When centralized systems collapse, communities capable of preserving practical local knowledge often survive better than those dependent entirely on fragile elite structures. The same pattern echoes across many ancient collapses. Classic Maya cities experience severe decline connected to prolonged drought, warfare, political fragmentation, and environmental strain. Norse Greenland settlements gradually disappear after climate deterioration and economic isolation. Ancient Mesopotamian societies repeatedly struggle against salinization, flooding, and shifting river systems. Across the ancient American Southwest, long drought cycles force migrations and settlement reorganization. Collapse rarely arrives as one dramatic moment. More often, it unfolds gradually through accumulating stress. Food becomes less reliable. Violence increases. Trust weakens. Leadership loses credibility. And during such periods, older generations may carry memories of previous crises younger people have never experienced. Anthropologists studying communities surviving famine or environmental disruption often observe the importance of cultural resilient systems of memory and behavior, allowing societies to adapt without total fragmentation. Elders preserve older agricultural techniques abandoned during prosperous years. They remember emergency food sources. They maintain ritual systems reinforcing cooperation when fear encourages selfishness. Sometimes the difference between survival and collapse lies not in technology, but in whether communities still know how to function under pressure. This may explain why oral traditions so often emphasize cyclical thinking rather than permanent stability. Many ancient cultures understand hardship as recurring. Floods return, droughts return, empires rise and fail. Winter eventually follows abundance again. The elder who remembers previous disaster can resist panic because they have seen recovery before. Perspective becomes survival tool. Environmental archaeology increasingly reveals how sophisticated some ancient ecological memory systems truly are. In arid regions, communities develop water conservation methods refined across centuries of drought cycles. Terraced agriculture reduces erosion in mountainous landscapes. Controlled burns manage forests sustainably. Seasonal mobility prevents overexploitation of fragile ecosystems. Much of this knowledge passes orally through repeated practice rather than written instruction manuals, which means collapse threatens memory directly. If social disruption kills older specialists or scatters communities too widely, adaptive systems vanish rapidly. Later populations may inherit landscapes shaped by forgotten techniques without understanding how those systems originally functioned. Modern researchers studying ancient irrigation networks, indigenous burning practices, and abandoned agricultural terraces often discover evidence of sophisticated environmental management lost after political or demographic collapse. One especially haunting pattern appears after epidemics. Disease does not simply reduce population numbers, it disproportionately targets social memory. Older generations often possess the deepest ecological, ceremonial, linguistic, and practical knowledge. When epidemics sweep through communities, the resulting cultural damage extends far beyond immediate mortality. Languages vanish. Songs disappear. Medicinal expertise collapses. Migration routes are forgotten. The intellectual consequences can last centuries. This pattern becomes devastating during colonial encounters beginning in the late 15th century, when introduced diseases destroy large portions of indigenous populations across the Americas and Pacific before many traditions are documented externally. Entire systems of environmental understanding disappear almost invisibly alongside human lives. Modern science continues rediscovering fragments of knowledge preserved imperfectly in oral tradition, despite these catastrophic losses. The ancient world experiences similar disappearances repeatedly, even if direct evidence rarely survives. A drought wipes out elder farmers who understand complex irrigation timing. War kills navigators carrying mental maps of trade routes. Famine destroys ritual specialists preserving seasonal coordination. Migration scatters communities before apprenticeship is complete. Knowledge extinction accompanies human extinction constantly throughout history. And yet humans also demonstrate remarkable resilience. Again and again, small groups survive catastrophes that appear overwhelming. Archaeology reveals communities reorganizing after volcanic eruptions, adapting after climate shifts, rebuilding after invasions, and continuing cultural traditions despite enormous disruption. Part of this resilience comes from flexibility. Part comes from cooperation. And part comes from memory. A group that remembers earlier collapse can prepare differently when danger returns. They may store food earlier, migrate sooner, diversify resources, or maintain alliances instead of exhausting themselves through internal conflict. This does not guarantee survival. Many societies still disappear despite experience and preparation. Climate shifts sometimes exceed previous human memory entirely. New diseases emerge without precedent. Political systems become too rigid to adapt quickly enough. Environmental degradation accumulates gradually until recovery becomes impossible. Even wise societies can fail. Still, what survives in the record suggests that remembered knowledge consistently improves humanity's odds. One revealing example comes from ancient drought traditions preserved in oral cultures worldwide. Some communities maintain ceremonies, food storage practices, migration customs, or water restrictions rooted in memories of earlier scarcity. Outsiders occasionally dismiss such customs as overly cautious or irrational during prosperous periods. Then severe drought returns, and suddenly the old rules make sense again. Modern climate scientists increasingly collaborate with indigenous communities, partly because traditional ecological knowledge sometimes preserves long-term environmental observations, absent from short modern datasets. Oral traditions may contain records of rare floods, unusual animal behavior, historical fire cycles, or shifting weather patterns extending farther back than formal scientific measurement. The evidence remains complex, and traditional knowledge is not infallible, but the growing recognition is difficult to ignore. Ancient memory systems often preserve real adaptive value, especially during crisis, because collapse strips societies down to fundamentals. When institutions fail, survival depends heavily upon local knowledge, social trust, and the ability to remember what previous generations learned under similar conditions. And so while kingdoms rise and disappear, while coastlines shift and cities crumble into dust, one of humanity's oldest survival tools remains astonishingly consistent. An elder beside the fire saying quietly, "We have seen hard years before. Listen carefully. This is how our people survived last time." Deep beneath layers of sand and collapsed stone, archaeologists uncover the remains of a settlement nobody remembers. The walls are still there, faint beneath centuries of erosion. Hearths sit cold beside broken pottery. Storage pits contain traces of grain turned to dust long ago. Human footprints hardened in ancient mud led toward what was once a riverbank, before the river itself changed course and vanished into desert. There are no surviving names for the people who lived here. No written records explain what language they spoke, what stories they told their children, or what fears haunted them during the final years before abandonment. Yet one thing is certain: they possessed knowledge once. Detailed knowledge. Knowledge of seasons, crops, animals, medicines, weather, water, migration, construction, ritual, and survival specific to this exact landscape. Entire systems of understanding allowed this settlement to exist long enough for children to grow old here, generation after generation. Then something happened, and most of that wisdom disappeared forever. Human history is filled not only with lost cities and vanished peoples, but with vanished intelligence. Ancient societies repeatedly develop specialized ecological and cultural knowledge adapted carefully to local conditions. When those societies collapse, migrate, or are destroyed, enormous intellectual worlds often disappear alongside them. Modern archaeology can recover fragments, rarely the whole. This is one of the great silences haunting the ancient past. Stone survives more easily than memory. A ruined irrigation canal may remain visible for thousands of years, while the techniques required to maintain it vanish completely within decades. Archaeologists may identify medicinal residues in ancient containers without fully understanding how the original healers used them. Abandoned agricultural terraces hint at sophisticated environmental management, whose full logic no longer survives. Every lost culture carries buried libraries no one can fully read. Sometimes the disappearance happens gradually. Climate shifts weaken populations over generations. Younger members migrate elsewhere seeking opportunity. Trade networks fail. Languages fragment into smaller regional forms until mutual understanding breaks apart. Knowledge becomes increasingly difficult to transmit consistently. Other times the destruction is sudden. Volcanic eruptions bury entire settlements beneath ash. Epidemics sweep through communities before apprentices inherit specialist knowledge. Warfare destroys ceremonial centers where memory once concentrated. Colonization suppresses languages and traditions deliberately. Drought scatters populations across unfamiliar landscapes where older survival systems no longer function properly. In every case, knowledge dies unevenly. Certain practical skills survive because they remain immediately useful. Other forms of understanding vanish almost instantly once social continuity breaks. Ritual songs disappear. Astronomical traditions fragment. Oral histories lose accuracy after repeated displacement. Sacred geography becomes meaningless when people are removed from ancestral land. This fragility becomes especially visible in isolated societies. On islands across the Pacific, archaeologists sometimes uncover evidence of remarkable adaptation, followed by collapse or transformation. Communities develop fishing systems, navigation techniques, and ecological practices suited precisely to local conditions. Yet small populations remain vulnerable to environmental disruption, resource depletion, storms, and demographic instability. Once knowledge chains break, recovery becomes difficult. Easter Island, known also as Rapa Nui, illustrates how complex such stories can become. Earlier popular narratives portrayed the islanders as reckless destroyers of their environment, leading themselves into catastrophe. Modern research paints a far more nuanced picture involving outside disease, colonial violence, slave raids, introduced animals, ecological pressure, and adaptation strategies far more sophisticated than earlier stereotypes allowed. The evidence remains debated in important details. But one thing stands clear. Much of the island's older knowledge system disappears under colonial disruption before outsiders fully understand it. The same pattern echoes worldwide. In the Americas, countless indigenous traditions vanish after European disease outbreaks devastate populations. Entire languages disappear before documentation occurs. Botanical expertise refined across centuries survives only in fragments. Sacred stories become disconnected from landscapes transformed by colonization and industrial expansion. Similar losses likely happen repeatedly throughout prehistory, though without written records the damage becomes almost invisible. Archaeology occasionally catches glimpses of these vanished worlds. In the Amazon rainforest, researchers once assumed large permanent societies could not thrive sustainably in such environments. Recent discoveries challenge that assumption dramatically. Ancient earthworks, engineered soils, managed forests, and settlement networks reveal extensive landscape modification by indigenous peoples long before European arrival. What later explorers interpret as untouched wilderness may actually represent abandoned cultural landscapes shaped carefully through generations of ecological knowledge. Then disease and collapse erase much of the system maintaining them. The forest survives. The memory does not. Elsewhere, archaeologists investigating the ancient city of Cahokia near present-day St. Louis uncover evidence of enormous social organization in North America centuries before European contact. Massive earthworks rise from the landscape. Trade networks stretch across vast distances. Astronomical alignments guide ceremonial structures. Yet the society eventually declines. And many details about its social systems remain uncertain because oral continuity fractures long before modern investigation begins. Humanity forgets more than it remembers. And some forgotten knowledge may once have been astonishingly sophisticated. Ancient navigation systems disappear. Agricultural diversity narrows. Medicinal traditions fade. Water management techniques vanish. Languages encoding ecological precision become extinct. Modern researchers occasionally rediscover fragments independently through science, only to realize later that older cultures already understood portions of the same principles through observation and experience. One striking example involves controlled burning practices. Indigenous fire management traditions across Australia and North America maintain ecosystems for thousands of years through carefully timed low-intensity burns. When colonial authorities suppress these practices, fuel accumulates unnaturally, contributing to catastrophic megafires in later centuries. The knowledge was not primitive. It was interrupted. The same may apply to ancient drought-resistant agriculture, fisheries management, flood adaptation, and biodiversity preservation strategies now only partially recoverable through archaeology and surviving oral traditions. Of course, not every lost tradition contains hidden scientific wisdom. Some beliefs are symbolic, spiritual, or historically inaccurate. Romanticizing vanished cultures can distort the past just as badly as dismissing them entirely. Ancient societies are capable of environmental damage, political oppression, warfare, and failed adaptation like any modern civilization. Still, the broader pattern remains profound. Human survival knowledge is far more fragile than stone monuments suggest. Civilizations often appear permanent while their intellectual foundations remain alarmingly vulnerable to interruption. This vulnerability shapes the emotional force of many ancient traditions surrounding elders and memory keepers. Communities understand instinctively that once certain people die, entire worlds risk disappearing with them. Songs no longer sung vanish rapidly. Oral histories collapse without repetition. Specialist ecological understanding becomes impossible to reconstruct fully after landscapes themselves change. Modern linguists estimate that languages continue disappearing globally at extraordinary rates even today. Each lost language contains unique ways of organizing reality, classifying environments, describing relationships, and preserving cultural memory. Ancient extinctions likely erase similar intellectual diversity on enormous scales long before written history begins. And somewhere beneath deserts, forests, submerged coastlines, and ruined settlements lie traces of countless forgotten teachers, elders whose names no longer survive, navigators whose routes disappeared, healers whose remedies were never written down, storykeepers whose voices fell silent during famine, migration, or war. The archaeological record preserves fragments of their existence. A worn tool handle shaped by aging hands, a carefully healed skeleton proving years of care, a ceremonial site aligned perfectly to stars no one there remembers anymore. Enough evidence remains to reveal something both haunting and deeply human. Civilization has always depended not only on what people build, but on what they manage to remember before memory itself is lost. In a quiet laboratory far removed from the ancient landscapes they study, archaeologists lean over the fractured skeleton of an individual who died thousands of years ago. The bones tell an unexpected story. The spine shows signs of severe degeneration. Several teeth are missing long before death. One leg healed badly after a major break, leaving the person permanently limited in movement. Arthritis scars the joints, and yet the individual survives for many years after these injuries occur, which means somebody helps them. Somebody carries food. Somebody waits while they walk slowly. Somebody protects them during migration and illness. Somebody considers their continued existence worth the effort. Across the ancient world, Archaeology repeatedly uncovers evidence forcing modern assumptions about prehistoric life to become more complicated. Early portrayals of ancient humans often emphasize relentless brutality, a world where only the stronger survive and weakness means immediate abandonment. Certainly, prehistoric life is harsh beyond most modern experience. Injury, famine, violence, and environmental danger remain constant threats. But what survives in the record suggests another reality existing alongside the hardship. Care, again and again. Archaeologists find signs that ancient communities support elderly and disabled individuals long after independent survival becomes unlikely. These discoveries do not prove prehistoric societies are universally compassionate or peaceful. Human groups remain capable of cruelty, exclusion, and violence in every era. Yet the evidence increasingly reveals that cooperation and long-term caregiving are deeply ancient parts of human survival strategy. And elders appear central to that system. One of the most famous examples comes from Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq, where several Neanderthal skeletons display remarkable evidence of survival despite severe disability. One individual, often called Shanidar, lives for years after suffering injuries that include blindness in one eye, partial deafness, major damage to one arm, and possible mobility limitations. In a harsh Ice Age environment filled with predators and constant physical demands, such survival almost certainly requires ongoing support from others. The implications are profound. For decades, Neanderthals are stereotyped as brutish and intellectually inferior compared to modern humans. Discoveries like Shanidar complicate that narrative sharply. They suggest social cooperation sophisticated enough to sustain vulnerable individuals over extended periods, and vulnerability itself may carry social value. An injured elder can still teach. A disabled hunter can still remember migration routes. A physically weakened healer can still diagnose illness. Ancient survival depends not purely on muscle, but on collective intelligence distributed across communities. Similar evidence appears in many different contexts. Prehistoric skeletons across Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas often show healed fractures, amputations survived long-term, degenerative aging conditions, and dental wear indicating advanced age. Some individuals lose the ability to chew effectively yet continue living, implying others prepare softer foods for them. Care leaves traces, and those traces accumulate. At sites associated with early agriculture, archaeologists uncover elderly individuals buried with symbolic objects suggesting continued status within their communities. Some graves contain tools worn smooth from decades of use. Others include ornaments or ceremonial items implying social authority. Scholars remain cautious about assigning exact meanings to burial goods because interpretations vary widely across cultures. Still, broad patterns indicate that older individuals are frequently integrated into social and ritual life, rather than discarded once physically weakened. This matters because ancient survival systems are fragile. Hunter-gatherer bands and early farming communities operate close to environmental limits. Food shortages occur regularly. Mobility demands enormous energy. Supporting individuals unable to contribute fully through labor carries real cost. The persistence of elderly care therefore suggests strong compensating value. Knowledge may be part of that value. Anthropologists studying modern traditional societies often observe that older individuals contribute heavily through storytelling, conflict mediation, childcare, teaching, ecological memory, and specialized craft knowledge. Elder women in particular frequently serve critical roles in food processing, medicinal expertise, and intergenerational stability. Some studies even show that communities with experienced grandmothers improve child survival rates significantly under difficult conditions. This does not mean every elder is automatically revered. Ancient societies are diverse and complex. Some older individuals lose influence. Others become burdens during extreme scarcity. Archaeological evidence occasionally hints at neglect or violence toward vulnerable members as well. Human behavior remains inconsistent across cultures and crises. Yet the broader trend continues appearing. Humans invest heavily in preserving experienced individuals. One reason may involve the unusual structure of human learning itself. Compared to many animals, humans require extraordinarily long developmental periods. Children remain dependent for years while learning language, social behavior, tool-making, environmental interpretation, and survival skills. Much of this education occurs informally through observation and participation, rather than explicit instruction. Elders become living reference points inside that process. A child watching an older craftsperson shape stone tools learns techniques impossible to capture fully through simple description. A young tracker following experienced hunters absorbs subtle environmental awareness accumulated across decades. Knowledge transfers through proximity, repetition, and embodied practice. Archaeology sometimes preserves indirect signs of this teaching relationship. Stone tool traditions remain remarkably consistent across generations in some regions, suggesting careful transmission methods rather than random imitation. Craft specialization emerges in certain ancient societies, requiring long apprenticeships. Cave art traditions repeat symbolic patterns over enormous stretches of time, implying stable systems of cultural instruction. Continuity does not happen automatically. Someone preserves it. The treatment of older dead also offers important clues. In many prehistoric burial sites, elderly individuals receive careful placement, grave goods, pigments, or positioning suggesting ceremonial significance. At Sunghir in Russia, Upper Paleolithic burials contain elaborate ornaments requiring thousands of ivory beads crafted by hand. Elsewhere, older bodies are interred near sacred spaces or alongside symbolic objects associated with authority or memory. Of course, archaeologists must interpret cautiously. Burial rituals often reflect spiritual beliefs difficult to reconstruct fully. Some grave goods may symbolize family identity, cosmology, or status unrelated directly to age. No single explanation fully accounts for every pattern. Still, the cumulative evidence points towards something important. Ancient humans repeatedly organized social life around long-term relationships rather than pure short-term efficiency. This may be one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. Many predators rely heavily on instinct. Human beings rely on cooperation amplified by memory. Communities capable of preserving older knowledge holders become more adaptable during environmental stress. They remember previous disasters. They maintain continuity after migration. They stabilize younger generations during uncertainty. The archaeological record even hints that emotional attachment itself becomes survival technology. Grief rituals appear early in human history. Bodies are buried carefully rather than discarded casually. Some graves include flowers, pigments, ornaments, or tools. Whether these practices reflect spiritual belief, social identity, emotional mourning, or combinations of all three remains debated, but they reveal something unmistakable. Ancient humans care about one another deeply enough to invest time and energy into remembrance. That emotional continuity strengthens social resilience. A group protecting elders today may trust others to protect them tomorrow. Knowledge survives because communities value people beyond immediate physical usefulness. This creates stronger intergenerational bonds capable of sustaining complex cultural memory over long periods. And perhaps that is why archaeology keeps uncovering evidence of survival that should not have been possible alone. The old woman with failing joints living decades beyond injury. The partially blind hunter surviving harsh winters. The elder healer buried carefully beside ceremonial objects. The aging storyteller whose worn teeth and arthritic hands reveal a lifetime long enough to teach generations. Their bones remain silent in the ground. But together they tell a story modern science is only beginning to fully appreciate. Human civilization may not rise merely from intelligence or strength. It rises from the decision to carry one another through hardship long enough for memory itself to survive. The river shrinks slowly enough that most people ignore it at first. Year after year, the waterline retreats a little farther from the old stone markers. Fish become less plentiful. Marshes dry around the edges. Farmers complain quietly about weak harvests. But the markets still function. The temples still collect offerings. And the rulers still demand grain shipments as though nothing fundamental has changed. Only the oldest voices speak openly of danger. They remember earlier dry years. They remember how quickly hunger spreads once the reservoirs fail. They remember villages abandoned along the southern floodplain decades ago during another period of weak rains. But memory alone cannot force societies to listen. Throughout history, human communities repeatedly inherit warnings from older generations and then choose to ignore them. Sometimes the warnings are dismissed because prosperity creates overconfidence. Sometimes political leaders suppress inconvenient knowledge. Sometimes younger generations simply believe the old fears no longer apply in a changing world. And sometimes the elders themselves are wrong. This tension between inherited wisdom and present ambition becomes one of the defining pressures shaping ancient survival. Tradition preserves stability, but excessive attachment to tradition can prevent adaptation. Innovation creates opportunity, but reckless confidence can destroy systems refined over centuries. Human history unfolds inside this constant struggle between memory and change. The ancient world offers countless examples. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest urban civilizations emerged beside rivers capable of both sustaining and destroying life. Over centuries, intensive irrigation allows agriculture to flourish in difficult environments. Yet irrigation also gradually increases soil salinity in some regions, reducing crop productivity over long periods. Ancient farmers are not ignorant of these problems. Textual evidence from later periods suggests awareness of declining yields and environmental strain. But large political systems often struggle to respond effectively once short-term demands overpower long-term caution. The same pattern echoes elsewhere. On Easter Island, environmental stress likely develops gradually over generations rather than through sudden catastrophe alone. In parts of the ancient Mediterranean, deforestation contributes to erosion and agricultural instability. The classic Maya world experiences growing pressure from drought, warfare, and political competition, even as rulers continue constructing monuments and reinforcing elite power structures. Collapse frequently arrives not because societies lack warnings, but because responding to warnings requires painful sacrifice. And painful sacrifice is difficult during periods of apparent success. Anthropologists studying oral traditions often notice how older generations preserve cautionary narratives shaped by earlier hardship. Stories warn against overhunting, greed, arrogance, territorial conflict, or disrespect toward ecological limits. To outsiders, such traditions can appear overly conservative or restrictive. Yet many emerge from accumulated survival experience. A community that once nearly starves after exhausting fish populations may establish strict seasonal taboos around fishing. A people devastated by flooding may avoid building in vulnerable locations despite fertile soil. A group fractured by internal violence may create rituals designed to limit revenge cycles. The logic behind these traditions is not always obvious to later generations living under more stable conditions. Prosperity weakens memory. When disaster has not occurred recently, warnings begin to sound exaggerated. Younger leaders who grow up during abundant years may view older caution as weakness or superstition. Innovations that initially increase wealth can gradually undermine long-term resilience. Forests are cut faster. Water reserves are stretched farther. Trade systems become more centralized and fragile. And often the elders watching these changes recognize patterns younger people cannot yet see. The Norse settlements in Greenland offer one haunting example of this tension between adaptation and inherited identity, established during the medieval warm period. These colonies survived for centuries at the edge of habitable territory. Over time, climate conditions worsen during the onset of the Little Ice Age. Sea ice increases, trade becomes unreliable, farming grows more difficult. Archaeologists still debate many details surrounding the settlement's disappearance, but evidence suggests the Norse struggled to adapt fully to changing environmental realities. They maintain European farming traditions poorly suited to deteriorating Arctic conditions, while neighbouring Inuit communities possess highly specialised survival knowledge for the region. The contrast is striking. One society carries advanced metallurgy, Christianity, and European political structures. The other carries generations of accumulated Arctic adaptation. In the end, it is the local ecological knowledge that proves more resilient. This does not mean tradition always triumphs over innovation. Many ancient societies survive precisely because they adapt aggressively to new conditions. Polynesian navigators settle unfamiliar islands through extraordinary experimentation and flexibility. Agricultural revolutions transform human population capacity dramatically. Trade networks spread technologies across continents. Younger generations often drive exploration and innovation, essential for survival under changing conditions. The relationship between elders and youth is therefore not simple opposition. Healthy societies balance memory with adaptation. The problem emerges when either side becomes disconnected from reality. Tradition without flexibility becomes brittle. Innovation without memory becomes reckless. Ancient political systems often fail when short-term ambition overwhelms long-term ecological wisdom. Empires expand beyond sustainable limits. Forests disappear faster than they regenerate. Irrigation systems exhaust soils. Overhunting destabilizes ecosystems. Elite competition consumes resources needed for resilience. And somewhere inside these crises, older voices frequently warn that familiar patterns are returning. Drought, famine, violence, displacement. The warnings are not always mystical or dramatic. Often they are painfully practical. Store more grain. Avoid conflict during shortages. Rotate crops. Leave certain hunting grounds untouched. Prepare for harsher winters. Maintain alliances instead of provoking war. Yet humans rarely respond perfectly to slow-building danger. Modern psychology offers clues why. People tend to prioritize immediate rewards over distant risks. Communities normalize gradual deterioration when changes happen incrementally. Political leaders avoid acknowledging threats requiring sacrifice or reducing prestige. Social groups punish voices seen as overly pessimistic during prosperous periods. Ancient humans are no different. Archaeological evidence sometimes reveals societies continuing monumental construction even during environmental decline. Elites maintain displays of power while ordinary populations experience increasing hardship. Ritual systems intensify as uncertainty grows. Trade networks become more fragile precisely when resilience matters most. No single explanation fully accounts for every collapse. Human societies are enormously complex. Climate pressure alone rarely destroys civilizations without interacting with political, economic, and social instability. But again and again, the record suggests that warnings often exist long before final breakdown occurs. The challenge lies in listening. This tension appears vividly inside oral traditions themselves. Many myths describe younger generations ignoring ancestral wisdom with disastrous consequences. Flood stories punish arrogance. Fire myths warn against greed or imbalance. Tales of wandering ancestors emphasize humility before unpredictable environments. Such narratives may function partly as social memory designed to preserve caution across generations. Do not assume abundance will last forever. Do not believe present success makes old lessons obsolete. Do not mistake temporary stability for permanent safety. These are ancient warnings, and they remain deeply human because every generation faces the temptation to believe previous dangers no longer apply. Even today, modern societies often rediscover the value of traditional ecological knowledge only after environmental crisis exposes weaknesses in centralized systems. Indigenous fire management practices regain attention after catastrophic wildfires. Ancient drought-resistant agriculture attracts renewed interest during water scarcity. Oral histories once dismissed as legend prove unexpectedly accurate about rare environmental events. The old knowledge returns because the conditions that created it return too. Somewhere in the ancient world, beside a river slowly failing under relentless heat, an elder watches younger leaders continue acting as though the seasons will behave normally forever. Perhaps they hope the warnings are wrong. Perhaps they simply cannot imagine their civilization ending. But the elder remembers another valley abandoned long ago after the rain stopped. And memory, however uncomfortable, refuses to disappear quietly. Night spreads across the desert in absolute silence while the stars emerge one by one above the horizon. Around the fire, younger members of the community watch an old man tracing invisible patterns across the sky with slow, deliberate movements of his hand. He names stars that rise before seasonal floods. He points toward constellations used to guide winter migrations. He recites stories linking celestial motion to planting cycles, hunting seasons, ceremonies, and the movements of ancestors long dead. To the people listening, the sky is not decoration. It is memory. Across the ancient world, specialized elders emerge whose knowledge extends far beyond ordinary survival skills. Some become shamans, healers, navigators, astronomers, ritual leaders, genealogists, or keepers of sacred lore. Their expertise organizes entire societies. They determine seasonal timing, preserve cosmological systems, mediate between generations, and maintain continuity between humanity and the natural world. Modern language often separates science, religion, mythology, and governance into distinct categories. Ancient societies rarely do. The elder reading the stars may simultaneously function as priest, calendar keeper, historian, weather observer, and political advisor. Knowledge remains unified because survival itself remains unified. Understanding the heavens is not abstract curiosity. It determines when rivers flood, when animals migrate, when storms arrive, and when planting must begin before precious seasonal windows close. In environments where survival depends upon timing, astronomical memory becomes essential. Long before telescopes exist, humans observe the sky with extraordinary attention. Ancient people track lunar cycles, solstices, equinoxes, eclipses, and stellar movements over generations. Certain stars become associated with rainfall, seasonal winds, or fish migrations because communities repeatedly observe these correlations across centuries. Elders preserve these patterns orally. In ancient Egypt, the heliacal rising of Sirius becomes linked closely to the annual flooding of the Nile, the event upon which Egyptian agriculture depends. In Mesoamerica, sophisticated calendrical systems emerge combining astronomical observation with ritual timing and political authority. Polynesian navigators memorize stellar pathways guiding voyages across open ocean. Indigenous Australian traditions connect celestial stories to geography, law, ecology, and navigation simultaneously. These systems are often astonishingly precise, not because ancient people possess modern scientific frameworks, but because repeated observation over long periods reveals reliable environmental rhythms. An elder who has watched the skies for 50 years carries an enormous archive of comparative memory impossible to replace quickly. And unlike written calendars, living experts can adapt interpretation to changing conditions. This flexibility matters because the natural world never behaves with perfect regularity. Seasonal shifts occur, storms arrive early, drought alters migration patterns. Astronomical specialists help communities interpret uncertainty by comparing present anomalies to remembered cycles from earlier years. The ancient astronomer therefore functions partly as a guardian against chaos. The same is true of shamans and ritual leaders. Modern discussions sometimes portray shamanic traditions as purely mystical or irrational, but anthropologists increasingly recognize that such figures often hold extensive practical knowledge alongside spiritual roles. Shamans may memorize medicinal plants, migration histories, animal behavior, weather signs, and social law in addition to conducting ceremonies. Their authority frequently comes from experience accumulated over decades. In small oral societies, specialists capable of preserving large amounts of interconnected information become extremely valuable. Ritual itself may help organize and transmit memory efficiently. Songs encode navigation routes. Ceremonies reinforce seasonal timing. Mythic narratives preserve ecological relationships. Sacred restrictions protect vulnerable resources during breeding seasons or drought periods. Spiritual systems and survival systems intertwine deeply. This connection becomes especially visible in harsh or unpredictable environments. Arctic communities maintain detailed ceremonial traditions surrounding hunting, because mistakes during resource scarcity can become catastrophic. Desert societies encode water knowledge inside sacred geography. Agricultural civilizations align rituals carefully with planting and harvest cycles. The elder performing ceremony is often preserving environmental coordination at the same time. Archaeology occasionally reveals how sophisticated these systems become. At sites like Stonehenge in Britain or Nabta Playa in Egypt, monumental structures align with celestial events in ways suggesting long-term astronomical observation. In the Americas, ancient cities incorporate solar orientations into architecture and ceremonial planning. Across Polynesia, navigation traditions preserve detailed star compasses capable of guiding ocean travel across enormous distances. Scholars still debate many specifics surrounding these systems. The evidence remains incomplete in places, and interpretations can become exaggerated if researchers project modern assumptions too aggressively onto ancient cultures. Yet one conclusion appears increasingly unavoidable. Many ancient societies possess far more sophisticated observational knowledge than outsiders once assumed, and much of it survives through elder specialists. The vulnerability of such systems is immense. When specialized knowledge depends primarily on oral transmission, Disruption becomes dangerous very quickly. A failed apprenticeship may break continuity. War may kill ritual leaders before knowledge transfers fully. Colonization frequently suppresses ceremonial traditions deliberately, viewing them as obstacles to outside authority. Once broken, highly specialized memory systems can disappear almost entirely within a few generations. This loss becomes especially tragic because ancient specialist knowledge often requires lifelong training impossible to reconstruct easily afterward. A master navigator cannot simply write down everything they know about ocean swells and expect a novice to understand fully. A ritual astronomer carries decades of accumulated observational nuance. A healer recognizes subtle environmental relationships learned through constant immersion rather than abstract instruction alone. Some knowledge exists most effectively inside practiced human experience, and this gives elders unusual authority, not because they are automatically wiser in every matter, but because time itself becomes part of expertise. The older astronomer has seen rare celestial events younger observers never witnessed. The elder shaman remembers drought cycles absent from recent memory. The senior navigator has survived storms that killed less experienced sailors. Long memory deepens interpretation. Many ancient cultures therefore treat elder specialists with a mixture of reverence and caution. They are often seen as standing close to forces larger than ordinary life ancestors, spirits, seasons, stars, death itself. Their authority may appear mystical, but it is also deeply practical. A community ignoring its seasonal experts may plant too early and lose crops. A voyage launched under poor conditions may never return. A neglected ritual may weaken social cohesion during dangerous times. Even if outsiders reject the spiritual framework, the underlying coordination function remains real. This does not mean ancient specialists are infallible. Ritual systems sometimes reinforce harmful hierarchies. Astronomical interpretations can become entangled with political control. Some traditions resist necessary adaptation when environments change too rapidly. Human authority structures always contain risks of corruption and rigidity. Still, the broader pattern persists across continents and centuries. Humans repeatedly create elder roles dedicated to preserving large-scale memory systems linking society to environment. The stars become calendars. Stories become maps. Ceremonies become ecological regulation. And elders become the living machinery holding it all together. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in navigation traditions. A Polynesian master navigator standing beneath open sky at sea may appear almost supernatural to outsiders. Yet what guides the canoe is not magic. It is accumulated memory refined through generations of observation. Wave reflection patterns indicating unseen islands beyond the horizon, the flight behavior of seabirds near land, the angle of stars rising seasonally above specific routes, every detail learned through patient teaching, every detail vulnerable to extinction if transmission fails. The ancient world survives partly because certain individuals dedicate entire lifetimes to remembering patterns larger communities cannot track alone. And somewhere beneath cold starlight, beside desert fires, forest shrines, mountain observatories, and ocean canoes moving through darkness, elderly figures continue watching the heavens carefully. Because when landscapes become uncertain and civilizations begin to shake, humans have always looked upward, searching for patterns that still remain. The old tracker stops beside a patch of disturbed earth so faint that nobody else in the hunting party even notices it. Wind has already begun softening the edges. Dry grass bends across the surface. To younger eyes, the ground appears empty, but the elder kneels slowly and studies the marks in silence. A herd passed here recently, not large, moving north. One animal injured slightly in the rear leg. The pace changed near the ridge ahead, meaning water is probably close. None of this knowledge exists in words alone. It lives in experience. For most of human history, survival depends upon forms of understanding too subtle, complex, and embodied to preserve easily through writing. Even after civilizations develop scripts and archives, enormous amounts of practical knowledge continue passing primarily through demonstration, apprenticeship, repetition, and direct observation. The ancient world therefore relies heavily upon elders not simply because they remember facts, but because they carry skills impossible to fully explain abstractly. A written description of tracking cannot replace decades spent reading landscapes. A diagram of ocean currents cannot substitute for years at sea feeling the motion of swells beneath a canoe. A list of medicinal plants cannot convey the intuition developed through repeated encounters with illness, climate, smell, texture, timing, and human bodies under stress. Some knowledge must be lived before it can be understood. Anthropologists sometimes refer to this as tacit knowledge expertise difficult to formalize completely because it depends upon accumulated sensory experience. Ancient societies overflow with such knowledge. Hunters interpret broken branches, bird calls, disturbed insects, and faint tracks invisible to outsiders. Farmers read soil moisture through touch and smell. Navigators sense subtle wave interactions indicating distant islands beyond sight. Healers notice tiny behavioral changes preceding serious illness. These abilities often appear almost supernatural to strangers. In reality, they are the result of long immersion guided by patient teaching across generations. And time matters enormously. A younger hunter may recognize common tracks. An elder remembers how those tracks differ during drought years, breeding seasons, storms, or migration shifts. A novice sailor memorizes stars mechanically. A master navigator understands how cloud formations, swells, and seasonal wind variations interact dynamically across changing conditions. This layered understanding cannot be rushed. It accumulates slowly through years of correction, failure, repetition, and survival, which makes elder expertise extraordinarily difficult to replace once lost. One striking example comes from traditional Polynesian navigation. European observers encountering Pacific voyaging cultures often struggle to understand how navigators cross immense ocean distances without compasses or charts. Yet master navigators preserve intricate mental systems combining stars, wave patterns, bird behavior, cloud reflection, currents, and timing. Much of this expertise resists direct translation into written instruction. Modern revival efforts attempting to preserve traditional navigation repeatedly discover that books alone are insufficient. Apprentices must spend years at sea learning how experienced navigators interpret constantly shifting environmental cues. The knowledge lives partly in the body itself in trained perception shaped through prolonged exposure. The same principle applies across countless ancient survival systems. Australian Aboriginal trackers demonstrate extraordinary ability to reconstruct movement from minimal traces. Arctic hunters interpret ice conditions through sound, texture, colour, and subtle environmental changes. Desert communities navigate landscapes outsiders perceive as featureless. Traditional agriculturalists predict weather shifts using combinations of animal behaviour, humidity, wind, and plant response accumulated through long observation. None of this knowledge is mystical, but it is deeply experiential, and experience grows strongest with age. Archaeology struggles to capture these dimensions of human history because tacit knowledge fossilizes poorly. Stone tools survive. the techniques required to use them skillfully often vanish. Ancient boats decay. Navigation expertise disappears almost entirely unless preserved through living tradition. The archaeological record therefore underestimates how cognitively sophisticated many ancient societies truly are. A simple spear point tells only part of the story. The hunter using it may understand animal psychology, landscape memory, weather forecasting, group coordination, seasonal timing, and wound patterns at levels impossible to reconstruct fully from artifacts alone. This hidden complexity becomes especially important during environmental crisis or migration. Communities entering unfamiliar territory cannot rely solely on inherited routines. Elders must help translate older principles into new landscapes. Which plants resemble poisonous species from elsewhere? Which unfamiliar animals behave unpredictably? How do local weather patterns differ from ancestral homelands? These judgments require flexible expertise rather than rigid memorization. The fragility of tacit knowledge also explains why cultural collapse can become so devastating, even when physical survival continues. A displaced population may retain language and identity, while losing highly specialized environmental understanding tied to ancestral landscapes. Traditional fishing methods fail in unfamiliar waters. Seasonal migration timing no longer aligns with new ecosystems. Sacred stories lose geographic anchors once people are removed from original territories. Knowledge survives best when people remain connected continuously to the environments that shaped it. Colonial disruption repeatedly demonstrates this vulnerability. Indigenous communities forced from ancestral lands often lose access to ecological relationships embedded deeply within language, ritual, and daily practice. Traditional burning systems collapse. Hunting expertise weakens. Medicinal knowledge becomes harder to apply when familiar plants disappear. The same processes likely unfold throughout ancient history whenever migration, conquest, climate shifts, or epidemics fracture continuity between generations. And yet humans continually attempt to preserve difficult knowledge through culture. Songs encode navigation routes because rhythm aids memory. Ritual repetition preserves seasonal timing. Stories attach practical lessons to emotional significance. Apprenticeships immerse younger people beside experts for years rather than relying on abstract explanation alone. Ancient societies understand instinctively that some forms of wisdom cannot survive casual transmission. They require relationships. This may help explain why elders often occupy teaching roles even in highly physical survival tasks. An aging hunter may no longer chase animals across mountains, but they can still train perception itself. They can teach patience, timing, interpretation, restraint, and anticipation. In many ways, the most important ancient skills involve not physical action but attention. Knowing what matters, knowing what to ignore, knowing when ordinary patterns begin changing. Such judgment emerges slowly. Modern neuroscience increasingly supports this distinction between raw processing speed and pattern recognition, accumulated through long experience. Younger individuals often react faster. Older experts frequently make better complex judgments in familiar domains because they unconsciously recognize patterns built through decades of exposure. The ancient world rewards this ability heavily. A younger traveller may panic during unusual weather. An elder recognizes signs of a passing seasonal shift. A novice hunter may pursue dangerous prey recklessly. An experienced tracker notices subtle indicators of injury or aggression. A young leader may interpret temporary abundance as permanent stability. An elder remembers previous collapse hidden behind current prosperity. Time itself sharpens perception. Of course, experience can also become limitation. Older specialists sometimes cling too tightly to familiar methods when environments change radically. Expertise built for one world may fail in another. Human history contains many examples of tradition resisting necessary adaptation. Still, ancient survival consistently depends upon balancing innovation with inherited embodied knowledge. Because no society can rediscover everything from the beginning every generation. The old tracker beside the fading footprints does not merely possess information. He possesses trained awareness shaped through thousands of earlier observations, many inherited from teachers already dead long before his birth. And somewhere within that chain of memory lies one of humanity's greatest hidden achievements. Not just intelligence, the ability to pass lived experience from one mind into another across centuries without ever writing it down. Smoke rises carefully through the forest as small controlled fires move beneath the trees in slow, deliberate lines. The flames never climb high enough to become catastrophic. Dead brush burns away quietly. New growth will emerge here later. Animals will return to the cleared spaces. The land is being managed with patience refined over countless generations. For a long time, outsiders fail to understand what they're seeing. European colonists arriving in Australia and the Americas often interpret these landscapes as untouched wilderness shaped only by nature. Forests appear wild, grasslands appear naturally open. Seasonal burning practices are dismissed as primitive or destructive. In many regions, colonial authorities suppress indigenous ecological traditions deliberately, replacing them with centralized management systems built on very different assumptions about land. Then the fires grow larger, hotter, harder to control, and slowly, modern science begins rediscovering something ancient societies understood long ago. Human survival depends upon listening carefully to accumulated environmental memory. Across the world today, researchers increasingly collaborate with indigenous communities whose oral traditions preserve detailed ecological knowledge gathered across centuries or even millennia. Fire management, drought prediction, fisheries regulation, medicinal botany, animal migration patterns, and sustainable harvesting techniques once dismissed as folklore now receive serious scientific attention. The shift is profound. For generations, many industrial societies assume written data and modern technology automatically supersede oral tradition. Yet repeated environmental crises reveal the limitations of short-term thinking disconnected from long historical memory. Indigenous knowledge systems often contain observations extending far beyond the time frame of modern scientific records, and elders remain central to preserving those systems. In northern Australia, Aboriginal fire practices known broadly as cultural burning use, low-intensity seasonal fires to reduce fuel accumulation, encourage biodiversity, and maintain ecological balance. These techniques are highly localized and vary between communities, but the underlying principle is consistent, regular small burns prevent catastrophic megafires later. Modern ecological research increasingly supports the effectiveness of such practices. Where traditional burning disappears, landscapes often become more vulnerable to massive uncontrolled fires. The knowledge was never absent. It was ignored. Similar patterns appear elsewhere. Indigenous fisheries management systems along the Pacific Northwest historically regulate harvesting through seasonal restrictions, habitat protection, and ceremonial obligations tied closely to ecological rhythms. Traditional Polynesian navigation techniques are being revived successfully using methods once considered nearly impossible without modern instruments. In Arctic regions, indigenous hunters continue contributing detailed observations about changing ice conditions and animal behavior valuable for climate research. What survives in these traditions often reflects extraordinarily long relationships between people and place. This does not mean oral knowledge is infallible or universally superior to scientific analysis. Traditional systems can contain inaccuracies, internal disagreements, symbolic elements, or practices unsuitable under radically altered modern conditions. Romanticizing indigenous knowledge into mystical perfection distorts reality just as much as dismissing it entirely. But the growing recognition remains important. Ancient oral traditions frequently preserve sophisticated environmental understanding grounded in sustained observation over very long periods, and those observations are often carried by elders. Language itself plays a major role here. Many indigenous languages contain ecological distinctions difficult to translate cleanly into modern industrial vocabularies. Terms may encode subtle ice variations, animal behaviors, seasonal transitions, or landscape relationships outsiders fail to notice. When languages disappear, entire frameworks for understanding environments can vanish with them. Modern linguists and anthropologists increasingly warn that language extinction represents not only cultural loss, but also intellectual and ecological loss. Every disappearing language may contain generations of accumulated environmental memory. This realization reshapes archaeology too. Researchers now recognize that many landscapes previously considered natural are actually cultural environments managed actively by ancient societies. The Amazon rainforest provides one striking example. Evidence continues mounting that large areas are shaped significantly by indigenous cultivation, selective planting, engineered soils, and controlled ecological management long before European arrival. The forest itself becomes partly a human inheritance. Elsewhere, ancient irrigation systems, terraced agriculture, flood management techniques, and rotational farming strategies reveal sophisticated long-term environmental planning. Some methods prove remarkably sustainable across centuries compared to certain modern industrial practices that exhaust soils or destabilize ecosystems rapidly. Again, the lesson is not that ancient societies are perfect environmental stewards. Some civilizations overexploit resources, trigger erosion, hunt species toward extinction, or collapse under ecological strain. Human beings have always been capable of damaging their environments, but ancient communities surviving longest often develop strong cultural mechanisms reinforcing ecological restraint. And many of those mechanisms operate through oral teaching, ritual continuity, and elder authority. Modern climate change adds new urgency to these questions. Scientists today increasingly study paleoclimate records, archaeological evidence, and traditional ecological knowledge together to understand how past societies respond to environmental instability. Some ancient communities adapt successfully through mobility, diversification, cooperation, and flexible resource management. Others fail catastrophically. The comparison matters because humanity now faces environmental transformations unfolding on planetary scale. Rising seas, extreme weather, drought, species loss, changing coastlines. Many of the pressures confronting ancient societies are returning under different forms, and once again, long memory becomes valuable. Indigenous communities in regions already experiencing severe climate disruption often notice subtle changes earlier than centralized institutions because they maintain continuous close observation of local ecosystems. Elders may recognize shifts in migration timing, plant behavior, water cycles, or seasonal indicators invisible within shorter scientific datasets. This convergence between traditional knowledge and modern science is not always smooth. Political conflicts, historical injustice, land dispossession, and cultural misunderstanding complicate collaboration deeply. Many indigenous communities remain understandably cautious after centuries of exploitation and dismissal. Yet despite these tensions, a broader pattern emerges. The farther humanity moves into ecological uncertainty, the more valuable long-term memory becomes. And long-term memory is exactly what elder-centered oral traditions specialize in preserving. Even modern neuroscience increasingly supports the importance of intergenerational knowledge transmission. Human learning depends heavily upon social modeling, emotional connection, and cumulative cultural inheritance. People do not merely discover survival individually. They inherit systems of interpretation built slowly across countless earlier lives. This inheritance stretches farther back than most modern societies usually acknowledge. A traditional fire practice preserved by elders today may reflect ecological experimentation extending across hundreds or thousands of years. A navigation chant may encode routes followed for generations before written maps exist. A seasonal ceremony may preserve climate adaptation strategies shaped by ancient drought cycles no longer consciously remembered in detail. The continuity is astonishing and fragile. Many elder knowledge keepers alive today belong to some of the last generations carrying uninterrupted oral traditions stretching deep into prehistory. Globalization, urbanization, language decline, ecological destruction, and cultural assimilation continue threatening these systems rapidly. In some communities, elders describe younger generations losing interest in traditional practices under pressure from modern economic realities. The same ancient danger returns again. When memory chains break, reconstruction becomes difficult or impossible. And perhaps this is why the old stories matter so much. Not because the past contains magical answers to every modern problem, but because human beings survive longest when they remember that knowledge accumulates slowly and disappears quickly. Somewhere tonight, an elderly firekeeper watches controlled flames move carefully beneath forest trees exactly as earlier generations taught before her. Somewhere an Arctic elder explains ice conditions to younger hunters beneath a changing sky. Somewhere navigators still memorize stars older than any empire. And across the modern world, scientists increasingly realize that humanity's future may depend partly on how much ancient wisdom still survives long enough to be heard. The fire is smaller now. Only embers remain beneath the drifting night wind while the oldest members of the camp continue speaking softly to the younger ones gathered nearby. Beyond the edge of the light waits a world still filled with danger, predators moving through darkness, rivers capable of sudden flooding, winters that may arrive too early, strangers who may trade peacefully or kill without warning. Nothing about the ancient world guarantees survival, and yet humanity endures, not because the species is the strongest, not because it is the fastest, not because it possesses claws, armor, venom, or overwhelming size. Human beings survive because they become something unusual among living creatures, a species capable of inheriting memory. Across tens of thousands of years, through climate catastrophe, migration, famine, war, epidemic disease, and environmental collapse, humans develop ways to preserve experience beyond the lifespan of any single individual. Stories, rituals, songs, ceremonies, scars, landscapes, stars, burial traditions, and oral teachings all become tools for carrying survival knowledge through time. At the center of that system stand the elders, not perfect people, not infallible authorities. Human history repeatedly shows older generations capable of fear, rigidity, political manipulation, and dangerous mistakes like everyone else. Some traditions preserve wisdom, others preserve prejudice or outdated thinking. No romantic version of the past can erase the brutality and suffering woven through ancient life. Still, the broader pattern remains difficult to ignore. Again and again, societies survive because older generations remember things younger people have never experienced before. The elder remembers the hidden spring during drought. The healer remembers the fever that returned every few winters. The navigator remembers stars obscured during storm season. The storyteller remembers which valleys flooded when the sea rose last time. The astronomer remembers the unusual sky before earlier crop failure. The grandmother remembers how panic nearly destroyed the community during the last famine. Memory becomes humanity's oldest infrastructure. Long before written law, formal science, or centralized government, survival depends upon fragile chains of transmission stretching between generations. Children learn not merely facts but ways of seeing, how to notice patterns, how to interpret danger, how to balance caution with adaptation, how to recognize that no civilization, however powerful, stands permanently beyond collapse. This cumulative inheritance may be humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage. Other species adapt primarily through genetic change unfolding across immense stretches of time. Humans adapt culturally with extraordinary speed. Knowledge discovered by one generation can spread rapidly through teaching rather than waiting for biological evolution alone. Fire technology, clothing, navigation, medicine, ecological management, and social cooperation all expand human survival far beyond natural physical limitations. But cultural adaptation carries a hidden weakness. It depends entirely on continuity. Break the chain and knowledge disappears. Ancient history is filled with these invisible extinctions. Languages vanish. Navigation systems collapse. Ceremonial memory fades. Agricultural expertise disappears after migration or conquest. Ecological understanding refined across centuries dies alongside the last elders able to teach it properly. Civilizations often look solid from a distance while their memory systems remain frighteningly fragile underneath. The modern world sometimes forgets this because information now appears permanent. Books, digital archives, satellites, and global communication create the illusion that knowledge can no longer truly vanish. Yet even now, languages continue disappearing. Ecological memory fades when communities lose connection to landscapes. Traditional skills vanish within generations if no one practices them. Human memory still lives inside people, and people remain mortal. Perhaps this is why ancient societies invest so heavily in ritual repetition and respect for elders, not simply from sentiment or superstition, but from recognition that continuity itself requires deliberate protection. Knowledge survives only when communities choose to preserve it actively. Archaeology reveals this truth constantly. The ruins of forgotten cities are not merely evidence of collapsed buildings, they are evidence of interrupted memory. Somewhere inside every abandoned settlement once existed people who understood exactly how to survive there. They knew the seasons, the water systems, the dangerous winds, the local plants, the flood patterns, the burial customs, the migration routes. Then something severed the chain, and later generations inherited only fragments. Modern science has become increasingly powerful at recovering those fragments. Paleoclimate research reconstructs ancient droughts and volcanic winters. DNA analysis traces migration pathways across continents. Archaeology uncovers forgotten engineering systems and agricultural techniques. Linguistics reveals connections between distant cultures. Anthropology documents surviving oral traditions before they disappear completely. Yet even the best research often reaches a final limit. Certain ancient experiences cannot be fully reconstructed once living continuity is gone. The feeling of navigating open ocean entirely by stars and swells. The instinctive recognition of changing snow conditions after decades on Arctic ice. The emotional force of stories repeated beside fires for thousands of years. The subtle judgment separating safe plants from deadly ones during famine. The exact rhythm of ceremonies synchronizing communities with seasonal cycles. Some knowledge resists excavation. It existed most completely inside relationships between human beings. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson carried across humanity's long survival. Civilization is not built only from stone, metal, and written records. It is built from trust between generations. A child listening carefully, an elder choosing to teach, a community deciding that memory matters enough to preserve. The ancient world disappears slowly beneath modern cities, rising seas, desert sands, collapsing forests, and the erosion of time. Entire peoples vanish without leaving names behind. Yet traces of their wisdom still survive scattered through humanity itself in stories, languages, rituals, ecological practices, and the stubborn instinct to seek guidance from those who remember more than we do. Even now, modern societies facing climate instability, environmental strain, political uncertainty, and technological upheaval continue rediscovering something ancient humans understood intuitively. No generation survives alone. Every society inherits knowledge it did not create. Every civilization depends partly on whether it can carry hard-earned memory forward before disaster arrives again. And somewhere in the darkness beyond recorded history, countless forgotten elders once sat beside fading fires, teaching younger people how to endure a dangerous world they themselves would not live to see. Most of their names are gone. Their stories survive anyway. The night grows quieter after the stories end. Wind moves softly across the grasslands where ancient camps once stood. Rivers continue cutting through valleys older than memory. Far out along forgotten coastlines, waves break against land that human beings have crossed for tens of thousands of years. Somewhere beneath forests and deserts lie buried hearths, worn tools, fragments of bone, and the faint remains of lives spent struggling against hunger, cold, illness, fear, and uncertainty. Most of those people leave behind no monuments, no written names, no empires, and yet the modern world still carries pieces of them forward. A survival instinct learned during ancient winters, a story shaped by distant catastrophe, a medicinal tradition refined beside prehistoric fires, a pathway across sea or desert remembered long enough to become culture itself. Human history is filled with these quiet inheritances passing invisibly from one generation into the next. The elders of the ancient world understood something easy to forget in more comfortable times. Civilization is fragile. Knowledge is fragile. Memory is fragile. The distance between survival and disappearance can become frighteningly small when drought arrives, when the sea rises, when crops fail, when disease spreads, or when people stop listening to those who remember earlier dangers. But the ancient world also reveals another truth. Human beings are remarkably resilient when memory survives with them. Again and again, small communities endure conditions that should have destroyed them completely. They adapt, they migrate, they rebuild. They preserve enough wisdom to guide children through landscapes transformed by catastrophe and time. And always, somewhere near the center of survival, there is usually someone older quietly teaching others what must not be forgotten. Perhaps that is humanity's oldest tradition. Not conquest, not kingship, not even civilization itself, but one person turning toward another across the firelight, sharing hard-earned knowledge before darkness closes in again. The embers fade slowly into the night. Above them, the stars remain where they have always been.